Okay, we're going to get started. It's 10 minutes after, which is when we start things. A little late, a little late, a little late. Well, because we're here to celebrate Florence and Syracuse architecture's role and history in Florence a little late. So it's only fitting that we start 10 minutes. Start the event 10 minutes late. So welcome everybody. I'm Michael Speaks. I am Dean of the School of Architecture. I'm thrilled to be here today. Got a lot of Florence hands here. We've got a lot of Florence experts, and we're looking forward to a really exciting conversation about the 40 plus years that Syracuse architecture has been in Florence. We have directors from each of the decades and periods there, and we'll have some discussion and respondents later on. I want to thank Associate Dean Julia Zerniak, who organized this. It's an exciting time to look back on Florence. She has been really incredible in the way that she's kind of reorganized and been attentive to Florence over the last 5, 6, 7, 8 years. And this terrific event will be due in large part to her planning. So, and we have a lot of our faculty and former faculty in Florence. We have, I think, some more than 100 people online, and I think I saw earlier students in Florence. So we have, the gang is all here, almost all here. So I'm going to do more than no more than say thank you all for coming. I think you'll find this incredibly interesting. And for those students, and I look out and I see some of our students who aspire to go to Florence, you will learn a lot today about the history of Florence and about what it's meant and about what it might mean for you in the future. And with that, I'm going to do my other job, which is to thank Dr. Erica Wilkins, who's been a great supporter of our efforts in Florence and elsewhere, but especially Florence. And she's here today. She's the Assistant Provost and Executive Director of Syracuse Abroad. And she's going to speak next. She's responsible for all aspects of the strategic expansion and management of Syracuse Abroad. And she plays a central role in advancing the university's vision and commitment to internationalization. As you know, Syracuse University is that's a real value and an important part not only of our school but of the university's efforts internationalization. Erica brings deep international academic and administrative experience to her role, most recently as the founding director of Syracuse University Study Abroad Center in Istanbul in Turkey, where she led operations from 2010 to 2017 until the center closed its doors due to political unrest in the region. Transitioning to Syracuse University in the US, Erica served in various global engagement leadership positions before being appointed to her current role. Prior to joining Syracuse University, Erica served as a faculty member and conducted research at several institutions worldwide, most recently as an assistant professor at Okan University in Istanbul. She also has worked as a research consultant to the World Bank and as a faculty member on the Soros Foundation Civic Education Project in Lithuania. She's conducted international research in several countries, including Canada, Belgium, Romania, Hungary, and India. She earned a PhD in political science from Syracuse University, a master's degree in international development from the University of Calgary in Canada, a master's degree in international relations from Lancaster University in the UK, and a Bachelor of Commerce degree from the University of Calgary. So join me, Syracuse Architecture, in welcoming the Assistant Provost and Executive Director of Syracuse Abroad, Dr. Erica Wilkins.
Am I speaking loud enough? I'm not an architect. I'm a political scientist by training, and now have the privilege of overseeing all of our study abroad operations for Syracuse University. So I come with that perspective to talk a little bit about kind of the importance of study abroad for Syracuse University students, and then to talk about why, from my perspective, Syracuse architecture in Florence is a particularly standout model of excellence in the study abroad universe, not just at Syracuse University, but nationally and potentially even globally. So just a few minutes of your time, and then I'll turn it back over to the expertise of the architects. And it's just wonderful to see all these students. And I know there's students in the background there in Florence, so hello to you as well. Syracuse University has always had pockets of excellence in international engagement through the international students, staff, and faculty at the university, through faculty research and partnerships, and in education abroad. More recently, the university, as Dean Speaks pointed out, has committed itself through the academic strategic plan to internationalization in a more comprehensive way. And Syracuse abroad programs have been kind of a cornerstone of internationalization at the university in many ways. Indeed, Syracuse abroad is nationally recognized as an industry, a trusted industry leader in education abroad, and is consistently ranked in the top 10 of study abroad by the US News and World rankings. We can talk about the methodology behind all of that at some point, but it nevertheless is something that we're proud of. We have a long and storied history in study abroad at Syracuse University, and Syracuse Florence is our flagship, right? It's been around for more than 60 years. And our London, Madrid, Florence, and Strasbourg, or London, Madrid, and Strasbourg programs are all coming up on 50 years, so nearly a half a century there as well. That is something we've kind of absorbed, but I think it's important to note that that's really unique in the United States. There aren't very many universities that have standalone dedicated centers for the university that have been around for such a long time, and that offer us ways to embed the curriculum of schools and colleges here, the needs of you, the students here, in an abroad program. That's a really unique opportunity, and something that's special to this university. In this field, we're known for high quality, academically rigorous, experiential learning opportunities, supported by best in class student services and supports, especially health and safety related issues. This has become more important, this latter piece has become more important than ever, given the increase in the number of students who study abroad, and the increase in student expectations for what that experience should be, and unfortunately, the increase in uncertainty globally, or at least our awareness and engagement with that uncertainty. I think it's always been there, but we're much more attuned to it now. Syracuse Abroad has a proven track record in successfully handling complex disciplinary, mental, and physical health issues of students, political unrest, terrorist attacks, natural disasters, and now, unhappily, we managed through a global pandemic. We're not through it entirely yet, but we're getting pretty good at it. So I guess that's a claim to fame in some level. Prior to COVID, we were sending over 2,000 students a year abroad, supported by 216 staff and faculty on campus and globally. So we're a big study abroad operation, and nearly 55% of our students who graduate had an opportunity to study abroad. That's pretty impressive, given that 1 in 10 in the United States college students study abroad. So that's a really impressive number. We also know, though, that 90% of incoming freshmen have signaled that they have an intention to study abroad. So we're working to close that gap between the 55% that do and the 90% that want to. But more remarkable is the School of Architecture's participation rates, which we classify as over 100% of students in the School of Architecture who have an opportunity and take that opportunity to study off campus prior to graduation. So how is that magical proportion possible, more than 100%? That's possible because, first of all, of the robust opportunities that are integrated into the curriculum from the School of Architecture that's offered to you. And that's both through the Florence Center, London, New York City, and other opportunities as well. It's also because many of you students, take the opportunity to study off campus more than once. And that too is unique, as is the notion that studying abroad for a semester or more, when the trend is short-term study abroad. And while short-term study abroad is very valuable, the longer you can go, the more you gain from it. And having an immersive experience where you really get to know the location that you're in is really important. So why is it so important for our students to have these opportunities? This is not an audience that really needs to be convinced of the value of education abroad. But I still think, well, especially because this whole symposium, is that what we're calling it, is dedicated really to exploring how living, working, studying in a location, a different cultural location, impacts on a discipline. And that's really exciting. Nevertheless, I think it's worth emphasizing the ways in which these experiences are important regardless of one's discipline and what we're trying to do at Syracuse Abroad in partnership with our colleagues on the main campus. High quality study abroad experiences are intended to help students develop a broader range of global competencies, to help them be better able to manage individually, professionally, and academically in what we are terming a globally interconnected world. We are of course not referring here to tourism or travel. While mere exposure to the art, cuisine, historical, and cultural delights of any country is wonderful and valuable, it does not make for the kind of transformative learning experiences that we expect from a good study abroad program. Instead, our goal is to intentionally develop programming that purposefully engages students with and to explore that which is different, that which is often uncomfortable, to challenge students' assumptions and to guide them to reflect on and learn from those experiences. So study abroad is not meant to be comfortable. It's meant to dislocate and take you out of your comfort zone, but in a supported way to really challenge the learning that you're doing, both in the classroom and outside. We aim to develop programming that encourages students to think comparatively, to develop a deeper awareness that our way, whatever that is not the only way, and that there is much to be gained in the curiosity and understanding of different traditions, perspectives, and ways of doing things. We want students to infuse these global competencies into all aspects of their lives, professional, personal, and into their communities. To put it in simple terms for our current context, we hope these experiences help cultivate not only better architects, whose perspectives and work are informed by the program and their experiences in Florence, but also better citizens. The Syracuse architecture program in Florence does all of this and more. So I'm going to conclude by really talking about how this program is a crown jewel in our study abroad programs at Syracuse and represents this standout best practice globally. While the data is a little unreliable for our first 15 or so years, we estimate probably about 2,500 students have studied abroad in Florence in the last 40 years. That's a lot of students. That's pretty impressive. Syracuse architecture has proven not only a pioneer in the historical sense in being one of the leading programs to start so early, but also in contemporary terms. You are one of the few schools that sent students to study abroad last spring, when most of the world was in shock and still in lockdown. But the intrepid architects were out there doing their thing in Florence and getting an experience that was quite unparalleled in cities in Italy that were pretty much vacated at the time. More generally and importantly, the School of Architecture has been at the forefront of recognizing the power of study abroad in advancing disciplinary learning objectives and increasing the reputation and prestige of the school and the university. You are unique among the schools and colleges in creating a highly internationalized curriculum which embeds off-campus study as an integral and lucrative part of the student experience. This is unique. It's not only unique at Syracuse University, but it's unique in most universities. It has taken advantage of the ability to specially design a curriculum that meets the students' needs in architecture, but also leverages the incredible expertise and opportunities in Florence and in Italy. In turn, this has become a powerful recruiting tool, and I think has made this program particularly attractive for international students as well as domestic. And finally, this program has been particularly adept at working with the local staff and faculty and really taking advantage of their deep and wide professional networks. Having staff and faculty that have been in place for a long time creates kind of the special secret sauce of study abroad. It is what gives students privileged access to things that you could never get if you were there on your own, or even if you were there for a fair bit of time. You're getting access to networks. And those networks can be leveraged in terms of the wonderful seminar series that are offered, in terms of new classes, innovative projects, new field trip opportunities, and also internships. So I think that in short, the partnership between Syracuse Abroad and the School of Architecture has been a long one, and it has been a particularly successful one. Over the last 4 decades, there have no doubt been many challenges, dramas, and intrigues that a number of you faculty in the audience certainly have stories about. But there is no doubt that this program has become a standout model for everybody and has offered an unparalleled learning experience for the students, thousands of them, and the kind of leadership and vision that will continue to inspire others to follow in your footsteps. So I'm really excited and honored to be part of this today and looking forward to seeing what comes next for us all. I hope you have a wonderful session. Thank you.
Testing. Ooh, that works. Thank you so much, Erica. Ooh, I'm gonna turn the other one on. There. Is that better? All right. Well, good afternoon and welcome. I'm Julia Zerniak, and I'm thrilled to launch this long-planned event. It's a year late, as has been told to you, but I think as a result, it's more refined and hopefully you think engaging. Is the echo gone now? Okay, great. So I'm just going to take a few minutes to do 3 things. I want to kind of outline a broad framework for this afternoon, introduce our speakers, and review the schedule. But first, I do want to thank Dean Speaks for his support of both these events, the one here today and the one in Florence in 2 weeks. And also to acknowledge Daniele Profeta, who's sadly not in the room, but he's in the Zoom room in Florence. And he's been instrumental to co-planning the event. So thank you both. All right, so as you know, you've been told many times, we are celebrating the 40th anniversary. And although it is a milestone to celebrate, it's an opportunity for reflection of 4 decades and aspirations for the future. And so we have this event, looking back, looking forward, so Architecture Abroad. But in 2 weeks in Florence, we're having one called Florence at 40, Pedagogies, Partnerships, and Projections, that not only recognizes this milestone, but acknowledges the support of the Florentine community, without which I think our success would not have been possible. Erica has already, hold on. All right, it doesn't work. All right. Erica has already gone over in quite wonderful detail the benefits of studying abroad, so I'm going to skip that part of my talk here, but I just want to remind the audience and many of our students that, as you know, the success of our engagement with these programs is the fact that it's, 1, built into our curriculum, and 2, that over the time of your 2nd semester and your 3rd year, or the 1st semester of your 4th, you can go to one of these locations and study away: London, Florence, Syracuse, stay in Syracuse, or go to New York. And as has been said, what makes Syracuse special and unique is these statistics. And these are from 2018, but 96% of our students studied abroad 1 semester, and around 67 studied abroad for 2. So with this bit of context, I want to consider the following, which is first the date, 1980. Obviously, this is when Syracuse Architecture began our program there. But not only was this the first year of our program, this same year marked the inaugural international and first official, thank you, Brittany Brissol, architecture exhibition in Venice. At the same time, well, actually a year earlier, I'm cheating a little bit here, the Pritzker Architectural Prize was established that's recognizing living architects for significant achievement. It's basically a prize considered by many as one of the profession's highest honors. So perhaps then this kind of coincidence of origin of significant academic and professional events gives us one lens into the disciplinary preoccupations, sensibility shifts, and social and political concerns of the last 40 years as they intersect with our discipline and profession. So consider first the Biennale. The theme of the first international exhibition held in 1980 and directed by Paolo Portoghese was called The Present of the Past, and considered the permutations of the postmodernist movement through an exhibition set up at the Arsenale, which was open to the public for the first time. Thanks to this exhibition, Biennale became an influential protagonist for lively international architectural debates and marked its ability to draw the most renowned and high-profile people and trends to Venice. The current Biennale, curated by architect and scholar Hashim Sarkis, advances an entirely different agenda. In the context of widening political divides and growing economic inequalities, Sarkis calls for, and I'm quoting him, a new spatial contract, and invites architects to imagine spaces in which we can generously live together. The Pritzker Prize Award offers another way of understanding the times, notwithstanding Philip Johnson, who was the inaugural winner of the prize in 1979. The decades are bracketed by, in order, Barragan and Gehry, Rossi and Foster, Kohlhaas and Zamthor, and Sejima Nishizawa and Isozaki. In our current decade, Irish architects and educators Yvonne Farrell and Shelley McNamara were named 2020 recipients. A portion of their jury citation cites that, and I'm quoting, they have tried with considerable success to help us all overcome what is likely to evermore become a serious human problem, namely, how do we build housing and workplaces in the world with over half of its population dwelling in urban environments, many of whom cannot afford luxury, end quote. Farrell and McNamara are the fourth and fifth female architects to be named Pritzker laureates. The French architects Anne Lacaton and Jean-Philippe Vissal were the most recent winners. During their ceremony acceptance speech, they stressed the importance of creating habitable spaces with a positive relationship to climate, starting with the principle of retaining rather than demolishing existing structures. So perhaps these bookends, if you will, provide some frame of reference for the reflections of today's participants. And to this end, Daniele and I asked them to consider loosely this following a set of prompts to think about the presentations they're giving you. And you can see them here. I'm not going to read them, on influences, on pedagogies, on outcomes. But, for instance, what was the architectural milieu that operated as your backdrop residence when you were in Florence? What were the models and methods of teaching implemented? And can you talk about some of the moments of engagement between the discourse of the program and the city or the country at large? And we really look forward to hearing them. So at this point, then, I'd like to briefly introduce our participants in order of appearance and highlight their work and the tangencies to the program. So I'll be very, very brief, but there are many, there are 11. So we want to give them all a little bit of explanation. So first is Randall Corman, Professor Emeritus, who joined Syracuse Architecture in 1977, and his research has focused primarily on the phenomenon of the architectural facade. Significantly, he's the founding director of the Syracuse Florence Architecture Program, and then returned to teach multiple times. Randall has served also as chairs of both of our programs, as associate dean and as interim dean. So welcome back, Randall. It's great to have you. Ted Brown's most recent research examines ways to link the art of assembly as a material practice with assemblage theory. The forum for this work is Studio RA, resulting in scholarly and creative text and design inquiries. Ted received the Rome Prize in architecture in the late 80s and returned to the Academy as a visiting architect later, and served as director of the program in the early 90s and returned as faculty 2 more times. Elizabeth Campbell's research focuses on urban housing and examines the relationship of social, political, and formal aspects of dwelling in the city. She's a registered architect and has practiced in the US and in Florence in association with Studio Alderossi. Liz was faculty in Florence from 2007 to 11. Richard Rosa is architect, educator, painter, and fellow of the American Academy in Rome. His work on the evolution of species of architecture type, language, and lineage dissects the dichotomy between present literal and latent formal structure in architecture. Ghost Stories, which is the first chapter of his forthcoming book, The DNA of Omine, analyzes the work of Rem and was recently published in the Cornell Journal. Richard's, this is interesting, his Syracuse firehouse renovation project will be completed this fall. We're looking forward to the opening party, Richard. And his painting monograph, Field Games, will be released in the spring. And Richard directed the program for 4 years, 2012 to 16. Daniele Profeta, who is in the Zoom room, he's our director there now. He's an Italian architect and designer and the current director. He's partner in AP Practice, a collaborative partnership with Maya Alam, and their projects combine everyday digital digital habits, contemporary imaging technologies, and traditional craftsmanship to surpass an introverted conversation and open up novel forms of practice. So second is our group of respondents. So each of the 5 speakers on reflections will have 20 minutes to talk about their decade. Then there'll be a set of responses by 3 people. So Paula Jacquelinea is a licensed architect and experienced university educator. Her research and work reflect her fundamental commitment to engaging architectural theory and practice, coupling her activity as a designer with scholarly research. She's the coordinator of the architecture program at Kent State in Florence, where she orchestrates several streams of activity, from directing the program to curating lectures to teaching studio. Britt Eversol's research is driven by questions regarding political economy and its intersections with architecture, urbanism, and technologies of design and building. As a historian of the 20th century architecture and urban history in Europe and the US, his work reflects a continued interest in historical and contemporary efforts by architects and planners to insinuate themselves into political processes. At Syracuse, he teaches design and theory. Mark Linder's research explores design theory and history considered in a transdisciplinary framework with a focus on modern architecture since 1950. And his work on imaging focuses the ways that the precise analysis, application, and understanding of images invites innovative research methods and collaborations. Mark teaches architectural theory. And finally, our panel, last 3, Lawyer Davis, his practice, research, and teaching focus on the study of the exurban built environment. And he was director in Florence for 4 years, 2008, 2012, and most recently chair of our undergraduate program. Kyle Miller's recent research through curation, criticism, and design identifies and produces novel aesthetic paradigms in architecture today through analysis of speculative investigations, small-scale projects, and new conceptions of practice. His recent writing in Possible Mediums, as well as in the latest issue of Log, constructs discourse that inspires and informs new links between academics and practice. And David Shanks, finally, is an architect and educator working to intersect high-performance design with low-cost construction. He's co-founder of the practice called ASDF, and David was the director of our program from 2018, 2010. So thanks you all. That was a mouthful, but it was great to have everyone hear a little bit about you. And I'd love you to join me. Oh, actually, one more thing. I kind of went over it. Here's our schedule. We'll start with the reflections. We'll take a little break. We'll do the responses. We'll have a panel, and then we'll have a reception. So please join me in welcoming our first speaker, Randall Corman.
Can you hear me now? All right, much better. All right, Julie, don't start the clock because I just want to take a quick minute to also thank Dean Speaks and the School of Architecture for sponsoring this event. I think it's no secret that the Florence program is very close to my heart, and the opportunity to reminisce and reflect on the past 40 years means a lot to me. And I also want to thank Julia for organizing this and Danielle for the work that he's doing in Florence. I know it's an extraordinary effort. All right, let me begin. The choice of Florence to be the site for the new architecture program in 1980 was an easy one to make, simply because the university, other than the fact that Florence is the home of the Renaissance and it is virtually an open book in terms of instructional opportunities, the university has had a presence in Florence since 1959 that included the purchase of this building, the Villarosa that you see there, that contains the classrooms, the faculty offices, a little lecture hall, at the time, a very reasonable library. And best of all, there's an in-house cappuccino bar. The first couple of years, the program bounced around to different sites for studios. And as the program expanded, around 1982, 83, we moved into this building, this homely little structure that you see there, onto the ground floor, and also the basement level. The studios were not ideal, but fortunately, I think the one advantage was that the neighbors didn't complain about the comings and goings of the students, and the students didn't complain too much about the space. We remained there for about 20 years until we finally moved to the current location, which is the Piazzale Donatello. An important component of the program was the finding and hiring the historian that would be teaching the history courses to the undergraduates and then eventually to also the graduate students. We were very fortunate through Werner Seligman's connection. Dean Seligman is on the right of the screen. He was able to locate an up-and-coming young historian by the name of Giorgio Ciucci, who eventually developed a reputation that is to this day a considerable one. Much to the benefit of the school, he remained with us for the next 25 years. There was a budget that was set aside in the program to accommodate the need for visiting faculty and as an opportunity to connect with the local professional community. And those individuals would come to deliver lectures, to sit on reviews, and also to collaborate with the faculty in studio projects. You might recognize Cristiano Torello de Francia on the left, who was one of the founding members of Super Studio in Florence, who became for us a very valuable connection in terms of broadening the reach of our engagement with the community. And then later there was Massimo Carmassi, who I believe taught here as a visiting critic for a semester, and then joined us in Florence for 1 or 2 semesters. He's currently still practicing in Florence, I believe, and he also teaches at the University of Venice. And this is just a sampling of the dozens of Italian and European faculty that and visitors that came through the program. This, in the early years, is a typical calendar of a semester in Florence, of the architecture program. The orange panels that you see running through the middle of it are a break period of 10 days, both in the spring as in the fall as well as in the spring. And those were created to provide the opportunity for the students to explore outside of Italy. They were encouraged to travel during those 10 days. And a lot of them did in a very, I would say, adventurous way, going as far as Turkey or Morocco. The green panels are the 18 or 19 days that were set aside for field trips. And that constituted one of the most important components of the program, that ability to go out and sort of kick a building, to walk into a space that you had only seen before in a history class slide lecture. And that program, that field trip program was operated under the umbrella of a course that was titled The Survey of Italian Architecture. It was a 3-credit course, and the requirements for completion of the course were participation in all the field trips and the submission of a complete sketchbook. One way that we were able to do this was to contain all of the classes within the first 4 days of the week. So studio, history class, electives were all taken in the.
You want to see your slides better?
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kyle. So all the classes were Monday to Thursday, leaving Friday, Saturday, and Sunday available for field trips that would range from 1-day or 2-day afternoon walks through Florence to 3-day excursions to Rome, to Venice, to Torino, and sometimes as far as Naples and Pompeii. On one of those early walks, when the students first arrived, we would take them out into the city to familiarize them with the monuments, with the spaces, with the character of the city. We would often make a stop at the Museo Firenze com Era, which is translated is Florence as it was. And in that museum, there is this speculative model of what Florence may have looked like when it was initially founded as a Roman settlement with the name of Florentia. The model that you see here represents a speculative reconstruction as it might have looked around the 2nd or 3rd century. That model, and then walks out into the city, provided the opportunity to talk about the kind of stratigraphic nature of Florence, that it's not one city, it's actually a series of layers that are Roman, that are medieval, that are Renaissance, Baroque, and 19th century as well. And in this aerial slide, you can see, in fact, the remnants of the Roman castrum, and the Cardo and the Decumanus is still visible within the city to this day. And on the right-hand side, inside the yellow box, is the old medieval fabric. On the left-hand side, you see the 19th century blocks of the Poggi plan. And in fact, there are still some remnant walls of the Colosseum that was outside the original walls. Usually we would make a trip, an afternoon trip out to Galuzzo to see the Certosa, which is a Carthusian monastery that no longer functions as a monastery, but is open to the public, wherein you can visit not only the entire monastery, but including one of the monk cells. And this was an important experience for the students because, as you may know, Le Corbusier made a trip to Italy in 1907 and stopped at this monastery and was fascinated by the economy and the efficiency of the monk's cell, such that he sketched it. And I think you know that eventually that was translated into the pavilion, l'Esprit Nouveau, that sits, the reconstruction of that pavilion sits on a site in a park outside of Bologna. So it was accessible to us quite easily, a 1-hour train ride from Florence. And it provided the opportunity to also talk about this notion of finding principles, ideas, strategies in historic buildings, historic ensembles, and that those things could be translated, transposed into a modern construction. Other day trips might be to Pisa and nearby Lucca, or to Siena and nearby San Gimignano. And always, always time was set aside for sketching. And the kind of sketching that was advocated by the faculty was not just naturalistic perspective, but also analytical drawings that represented not just what the students saw, but what she or he understood about the building that they were looking at or the space that they were looking at, and sketched that in such a way as it represented a kind of interrogation of that site and extracting from that interrogation principles, strategies, ideas, formal arrangements that were embedded, that were trans-historical, that were independent of the fact that it was a piece of historical architecture. And occasionally we would bring in visiting critics to help the students with their drawing skills. And always, whenever the opportunity presented itself, we would visit modern edifices, such as the ones that you see here. When going to Como, we would invariably make a visit to the Casa del Fascio. The moving force behind all of this always was Dean Werner Seligman. And it was through his love of all things Italian, through his deep knowledge of Italy and Italian architecture, and his strongly held belief of what the value of the Florence architecture program would prove to be to the students, as well as to the faculty and to the school as a whole. The past 40 years, I think, is evidence of that impact that it's had on the students that went through these programs and on the reputation of the school outside of Syracuse, outside of the United States. And it was Seligman that was that mover, that shaker. He was deeply involved in the program. He would often make visits to Florence to check on the studios, to sit on reviews, and to, in some cases, interview potential visiting critics. Now, I'm going to make the argument that there was a second person who exerted an influence on the program, but not necessarily directly, but indirectly. And that person was Colin Rowe. And he did that through his writings, through his teachings, and then eventually he participated in the Florence program as an instructor in the master's program that was developed around 1985, 1986. Now, at the risk of being overly simplistic, I'm going to suggest that there were three events that were fundamental in the way that Colin Rowe and his view of architecture influenced his approach to urban design, influenced the program in Florence, and to some extent the program here in Syracuse. One of those events was the publication of the collection of essays under the heading of the Mathematics of the Ideal Villa and Other Essays. That was published in '76, 4 years before the launch of the architecture program. And then Kolar City, along with his co-writer was Fred Coder. And that was published 2 years before the start of the Florence program. Now, I don't have the time to go into any detailed discussion of why I think these two publications were significant. Suffice it to say, with the Mathematics of the Ideal Villa, that particular essay, that Rowe argued about a relationship, an analogous relationship between a modern building and an historic one. That the idea that he advocated was that it was possible to look at history in a certain way that was trans-historical. In Kolar City, Rowe and Coder make a critique of modern city planning and suggest a much more nuanced way in which to approach the problem of urban design and city planning. The third event was the exhibition of the Roma Entorota project from 1978. As you may know, it was an exercise in which 12 international architects like Piero Sortogo, Robert Venturi, the Creer brothers, Michael Graves, and Colin Rowe was invited to intervene on the Noli map. Rowe's panel was this one, which is essentially a blank slate. And this was the scheme that he produced for it. And here's an enlarged version of it. Again, I don't have the time to go into any kind of detailed discussion of why Roma Entorota was significant. Suffice it to say that what you see here is a kind of proof of concept model for Kolar City. That's how I might characterize it. Now, to make my point, I want to show you a list of all the faculty that taught in Florence in those first 2 years. Where you see those X's in there, those are three individuals I have yet to identify. But what the list of faculty also show you is the growth of the program over time, so that in 1982, we expanded to 2 sections of students from Syracuse and 1 section of pre-architecture students. It coincided with the launch of the pre-architecture program. And then in 1986, the fall of '86, the program expanded again with 3 sections of Syracuse undergraduates, 1 section of pre-arcs, and then 1 section of the newly established Masters of Architecture program. So there were, over 1 decade, over 10 years, there were as many as 25 individuals who spent anywhere from 1 semester to 2 or 3 years in the program. Joel Bostic is the record holder. He's in that first decade, he spent 9 semesters in Florence. Now, what I'm going to do is highlight all of those individuals who took degrees, who were educated at Cornell University. And the point being that there is unquestionably a way in which there was a transposition of what I might call the Cornell school. What was being taught at Cornell, not just by Rowe and Coder, but by many others like Mike Dennis and Lee Hodgson and Jerry Wells and John Shaw and so forth. There was a kind of consensus among those faculty down there for advocating a particular approach to teaching studio that was to a great extent influenced also by the presence of Colin Rowe, who was there for 30 some odd years. These individuals were selected, handpicked by Seligman to teach here in Syracuse for at least 1 or 2 years so that they could be inculcated with the curriculum and the pedagogical goals of this program in Syracuse. And then, and only then, were they allowed to go to Florence to teach. And there were about 17 of them that did that. You see in the right-hand corner the ratio of 17 Cornellians to 9 others. And the others came from a variety of other schools. I might also, if I had the time, make the argument that there was another individual, Mike Dennis, who also was teaching at Cornell for many years, exerted a certain influence through his teaching and his writing. And this is an article that was published in the Cornell Journal of Architecture in 1981, entitled Architecture in the Postmodern City, which again, I don't have the time to go deeply into it, but basically takes in some ways the premise of Colau City and argues that it can be applied at the scale of a building. So urban strategies can be scaled up and down to building strategies. And a test of that was exercises that he ran between 1977 and 1979, 5 semesters in the design studios. One thing I forgot to mention is that one of the outcomes of the article was eventually the publication of his research under the heading of Court and Garden. The exercises that were done in the 3rd-year studios were like this one, where an individual was given a site. In this case, it was the Palazzo Romano. Somebody help me here. Massimo, yeah, the Palazzo Massimi, the brothers' site in Rome. And the student was given a studio, a program such as the Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies, and had to insert that program into this cranky sort of site using strategies of hierarchical distribution of poche and figural volumes that were at odd geometries. This project that you see here was done by the student Wilden van Kampen, who 8 years later, actually fewer than 8 years, about 6 years later, came to Syracuse to teach here for a while, and then went on to Florence to teach. And that's just an example, I think, of many individuals who went through that same sort of process. I know that people like Ken Schwartz and Steve Fong and others, Blake Middleton, went through one of Mike Dennis's studios. You're kidding. I can do it. I think I'm going to close now. And I think one thing that has to be said about the collateral benefits of the program was the way in which it developed, beside good Italian food that you could have on all these field trips. That's Bologna on the left and Venice on the right. But it's the camaraderie that was generated out of this close contact that you had when you were in Florence. The students lived together in apartments. Initially, they lived with families, but later on, we moved them to apartments. That's my signal? No, that's not. Okay. And they're together 7 days a week and often on the road in buses and trains. The outreach to the community began early on. In 1981, we organized an exhibition of Richard Meyer's work at the Florence Art Academy of Fine Arts. And then 20 years later, we brought him back for a lecture at the Palazzo Vecchio. And in between, and I know that my other colleagues will speak to this, that we had symposia other exhibitions, lectures, and so forth, in which we reached out to the community. And finally, I think, just for the record, I want to show you the charter group. These people are near and dear to me. I remain in contact with some of them, like Dan Allen and Steve Kilcoyne, who have a partnership in New York that I think came out of their time together in Florence. This fellow you might recognize here is Maurice Cox, who was recently designated as the Commissioner of City Planning in Chicago. He was the commissioner in Detroit. He was the mayor of Charlottesville, Virginia for a while. And I remain in contact with him and a number of others. Helen Cohn, excuse me. Helen Cohn is a specialist in healthcare services, a distinguished specialist, I would say. And up here, you might recognize Mark Robbins, who became the dean here at Syracuse University. And hiding behind Mark is our own Liz Campbell. Thank you.
This like you want to hand out. That's it. Good. Advancing with that. Okay. That was great, Randall. And you never want to follow Randall, let me say. I don't really feel able to discuss what we were doing in the 90s. We've got 20 minutes. That's a couple of minutes a year, but I was there early in the 90s, 90 to 92, and then again later, I think it was 96, 97. And so I would say lots of things in between. I really enjoyed Randall's piece. One question about the historical, transhistorical that might loop back as a question, or it might not. And also the lineage. And I guess I want to thank certainly Michael broadly, and Julia and Daniele specifically for organizing this, we're calling it a symposium, I guess. And also thank Werner. And I was interviewed to teach at Syracuse in the Garden of Villarosa, which we saw previously. I was invited to a review with Werner, Joel, and Colin Rowe. For the day, red wine in the evening, that was the interview. And they were very scared because, of course, I'm Princeton. And was the first of a transformation I would like to think of this school, at least to some degree.
You gotta get a special visa for you.
Yeah. When we talk about the 90s, there's a certain degree of euphoria. On the one hand, with the recent fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, and I certainly remember going with Werner with MR2 students. The wall was down, this was 1991, rented, I think, 3, maybe 4 cars, and on up to certainly Würzburg, Munich, Berlin, but then also formerly east into Dessau, Weimar, Potsdam, and Berlin. Think that at that time, circa 1990, Lech Walesa, after leading the Solidarity movement, is democratically elected as the president of Poland. And again, in the early 90s, December 25, 91, the Soviet hammer and sickle flag lowered for the last time over the Kremlin. So circa 1990, there's a lot going on. And in some respects, that kind of historical question, if you will, always resonates. And of course, also at approximately the same time in 1991, January 17th, we decide, which is to say our country decides, or certain members of our country decide to proceed with Operation Desert Storm, the first of our Gulf Wars. It was a scary moment at the Florence Center, I would say. I'll give Mike Good, who was director at the time, credit. We got maybe 6 TVs, put them in the Villarosa. CNN was hot at the moment. I mean, they were making themselves by virtue of Desert Storm, and we had students, faculty, and staff watching TV 24/7. At the same time, all of our signs were taken down. We were a very large U.S. presence in Italy, and there was great concern about some type of backlash against the U.S. anywhere, but certainly could be in Italy. Each morning we would meet, the administrators, and I was director then, we would meet at 7:30 to review evacuation plans in case we had to evacuate all students. We had maybe 350 or 400 students at the time. So you just didn't put them in a bus or put them on a plane. So Ted, you take this group of 67 students, you get out this way, another member of the administration, et cetera, et cetera. So it was both exhilarating on the one hand and also a little intimidating on the other. Andreotti is prime minister, which is almost a middle of an almost 3-year stint, which is quite remarkable. John Paul II is in his 2nd decade as Pope. Michelucci dies in 1990, a few days before his 100th birthday, and Aldo Rossi dies later in the decade in 97. In terms of context, to be sure, Colin Rowe and the Mathematics of the Ideal Villa, and other essays, certainly Collage City. I feel that the architecture of the city was a remarkably important text, a kind of Bible, if you will, at some levels. If, on the one hand, there are the publications that you see here, and I like to think that the publications, these are late 70s, Rossi's Architecture of the City gets translated finally in 82. They kind of percolate for a decade, and so I think they continue to have presence. At the same time, La Valette competition was 82, 83. It has its own version of percolation, if you will, and the deconstructivist architecture exhibition at MoMA was 1988. So all, in some respects, complex foundations, if you will. But I think Rossi's text that really emphasizes more structure, if you will, than figure. Certainly his interest in ideas of permanence and urban artifacts that transcend programmatic specificity were remarkably important. I think there are other texts, and David Coffin was a professor of mine and Anne's at Princeton, and Anne and I talked together in Italy and in the Florence program and other places, but in the Florence program for these 2 years, again, later in the 90s, and again, decades later. David Coffin's, in a way, intellection around the Italian villa is very useful. I think the Shepherd and Jellicoe text, stunningly important in terms of the ways in which they drew the garden. And I owe Michael Graves some of this, the way that someone like Colin Rowe might talk about, if you will, figures and figure ground in the city. Certainly Michael Graves would, relative to the landscape. And if you look in those little sections up there, Villa Medici, upper left, right next door, Villa Madama, stunning little drawings that could help teach, and hopefully we did help teach, how one might move the land, if you will, as part of design. So not for a prominent family in a republic, nor for the papacy, to be sure, but that there are lessons to be learned, if you will. I think that de Soto became more important later on in the 90s. We had Anne and I had a second stint at the American Academy in terms of maybe, say, shifting interests from object to subject. from the participants, if you will, versus the objects. And then the Friedman's book on Florentine new towns was really important, I would say, in a couple of ways. First thing is, I didn't know a whole much about the Florentine new towns. Quite remarkable. And the idea that there are new towns now that are not Renaissance new towns, but that well precede the kind of canonical Renaissance new towns. But he can talk about them both, or just does talk about them both, if you will, representationally, certainly formally, but also in terms of the territory. Why are those towns in those places relative to the kind of politics and economics at the time? And I think I had a conversation with Daniele a bit on this earlier. I think that there was certainly not fully formed, but some thoughts about thinking the territory, be it the Padana Plain relative to prosciutto and Parmesan ham, the Pontine Marsh, and the new towns there under Mussolini, or the Veneto. And I think that started to move through a little bit later on in the 90s, or at least our version. Okay. I don't have a whole lot of images and collected a few things. I think an important note was that the Florence program that I inherited from, as director, from Randall, et cetera, was pretty robust. So we had a 1 year, MR2 program. We had a 1 semester ARC 407 607 program. So that's MARC1s and BARCs mixed. We had a second semester for those students, which would be 2 sections. So 2/3 of our, we'll say, BARC MARC group stayed for the entire year, which gave us remarkable latitude and flexibility in terms of directing that spring program. Obviously, there's the field studies class, and then there's another field studies class. We were running a pre-ARC program that anywhere from 12 to over 20 students. So that meant that we had at least 5 or 6 so-called home faculty. There were visiting critics assigned to each of the professional degree programs. So we had a lot of people in the building. We had a lot of buses show up and on Via Bonvicini Friday morning. Friday morning, it's like 5:30 and there's 4 buses. You know, it's like there's the MARC bus. No, but yeah, the pre-ARC or the MARC first semester, or BARC first semester, second semester. Very, very interesting, very, very robust, with maybe 70, 80 students at one time. If there's the big kind of historical moment that we were in, certainly issues of some of the issues that Randall brought up previously, how an ongoing issue for Italians for centuries. How do they deal with their own history? And so here, looking at wonderful, except the Geraldo de Francia should be on the left, but Cristiano's Pensilina in Florence, right outside the train station from 1990, and then the project that's now complete by Massimo Carmassi on the left. What's interesting to me, on the one hand, is Carmassi's project starts in the 20th century and doesn't get completed until the 21st. There's something so Italian about that, you know, just brick by brick, as Massimo might. And then the Geraldo de Francia project almost gets torn down before the Carmassi project gets completed. But it'll last at least, I think, until 2010 before public outcry is such that it is removed. Which is more generally to say that there's this ongoing kind of interest and tension and debate, not certainly just amongst architects, but amongst the citizens, as to how do we build in the city. Just touching base on a few events, there was Michael Graves' publication and exhibition at the Marini Museum. Architour later in 1996 basically contacted us and got them involved so we could participate as designers for that. Other conferences that were going on in Florence at the time that we were asked to participate in, also at times exhibitions. So this is an MR2 project from '96, kind of design problem for Piazza Matteotti, which is in front of the well-known Palazzo Chiericati by Palladio. It was a competition in Italy, and we used that in that particular semester as a vehicle to study the Italian city, obviously specifically Vicenza, which I should have put there, but also then as a way to start to underwrite the field trips that might surround that and the kind of contacts. So we would spend time in the Veneto, certainly spend time with Clemente di Tiene and Mario Valmarano, old dear friends, now both dead, former friends, if you will, and is apparently dealing with similar kinds of issues. Julia asks us to make certain kinds of inquiry in terms of the construction of knowledge and ideas of research. And I think that I showed earlier, don't think it failed to mention it. What were our tools? I think we were reading. We had lots of guest lecturers, sometimes in the field, sometimes at Villarosa. And we had our pencils and bodies. And this is, and you may be able to read it, read one of the questions. This is the final exam for the second semester field survey class, which is really just trying to use any reference you want, most primarily your sketchbook, as a way to conduct a kind of comparative analysis. Some of it would, not in this one, but some of it would deal with typologies, to be sure, say arcades. You could look at 12 different arcades in Bologna. But nonetheless, simply and quite simply, a kind of comparative, for the most part, comparative analysis that was done in 3 hours and handed in with your sketchbook and becomes part of your grade. To get there, then students had to be in the field and draw, and we've had obviously some really talented students. This is from Kevin Sloan, it's clipped off there. Really talented students come through the program, but all of them, in a way, as Randall was suggesting, needed methods and tools to interrogate what they see or what they're occupying. How you might start to work descriptively and analytically. Ultimately, it might start to work projectively. Duomo and Luca on the left, and the San Ambrogio and Milan on the right. At times, again, that's descriptive. At other times, it's analytic. If we look at the study of the Rendentori in the middle, it's obviously not the Palladian church as we might know it in terms of its classical language, but rather looking at it in its spatial language, or Santa Maria de Miracoli, the kind of spatial straps that construct its spatiality on the one hand, but also start to see it diagrammatically and proportionally. And that's just what we were doing in the 90s. Sometimes a very analytic type drawing, like the cutaway axonometric of Teatro Olimpico that you see on the right. Others, like the ones on the left, more perspectival, of the Michelucci's church on the Autostrada. As Randall suggested, that there were times when we would stay home. So each Friday we would have a field trip, if you will, of some kind, but sometimes they would be in our own city. Really looking at urban structures then of Florence on the one hand, and then we'll say moments within that. So you see here Loggia dei Lanci on the right, which is embedded. Let's see if I can find it. Oh, too complicated. Well, maybe. Loggia dei Lanci is a little 3-bay, not so gigantic, but in this drawing, little 3-bay loggia in that location. So looking at it obviously across different scales and different drawing types. And also deal with issues of spatial narrative. You use Kevin's work here again. Might spend a morning, half a day or more, up on the hill in San Miniato al Monte, and try to deal with issues of spatial layering, issues of spatial narrative, and here again move from the abstractness of something like an axonometric to how it appears. So And this next on the left is Anne's schedule, not quite as neat as what Randall showed earlier. That's okay. I'll give you a sense, and maybe interesting here. If you can read it, week 2, you're in Ferrara for 3 days. Week 6, it looks like you're in Ferrara for 3 days. And that was really thanks to Anne's efforts, where we did a collaboration with the relatively new School of Architecture in Ferrara. Did a kind of workshop with their faculty and with their students. And supporting the courses are lectures. And you just look here, say there are architects, fairly well known, Francesco Venezia, Massimo Camasi, which we've mentioned, Cristiano Toraldo di Francia. Others are by our own faculty. Some deal with drawing, like Andrea Ponzi's. Many deal with specific cities, Giangi, Franzi's on Ferrara. Marcello Fantoni, spectacular historian of the court, if you will, not an architectural historian. But what we're trying to do, I guess, is situate our studies within some kind of intellectual historical context. As I've said often, I am an architect and professor. I am not a scholar. And so really try to use their scholars to be either join us before a lecture or even better, accompany us on a field trip. And that's one of Anne's drawings on the right, just working on Ferrara, and it's the movement of the Po relative to the development of the city. Okay, I've got now a minute and a half. This particular folio is of that 96, 97 year, a lead article by Fantoni on Ferrara. Some of the images come from our students' work. Included in it would then be the master's work, the pre-architecture program that Leah taught, and I don't have my glasses on, so Leah may or may not be here. I hope she is. If she's not here, she's on Zoom. A talk by Leah. We're working in the field. This was the results of the workshop with the University of Ferrara, their School of Architecture. The VC workshop with, in addition to that workshop, and then the other work. We are the visiting critics at that time were interviewed to get their take on architecture in the city in relationship to, I guess, primarily Italian matters. And this, which I won't go through, but it's really wonderful to ask who's around. It very well it clearly documents the kind of constellation of people that move through the program. Okay.
Great, thank you. Sorry, press point this time. Okay, yeah, good. Yeah. And this one. No. Thanks.
Okay, well, thank you both to Michael and to Julia. This is long overdue. I wanted to have a celebration and a review like this 10 years ago when Florence was 30. So it's great to be here. I also want to say that it was really Randall revealed my history. And so I'm going to speak a little bit about what it was like to be a student. I'm kind of privileged in that way. And then move on to the very different kind of position as a faculty member. So as many of you now know, I'm in the unique position of being able to speak in both of those kind of places, both as a student and as a faculty member. In between, I also work professionally in Florence with Maurice Cox, who you saw before, an alum of the program. The two kind of Florence program eras of my life were separated by many years, and certainly by a changed technologic and disciplinary landscape. But in those intervening years, the city itself, the Chianti, the not very good saltless bread, remain the same. What's not to love there, I guess. So to begin, a very few words about being a student in the first year that Randall was the coordinator, before I get to a kind of bigger picture as a faculty member. That first semester, the number of students was small. We came from at least 4 different institutions: Cornell, Cooper, University of Texas, and Syracuse. The mix of academic pedigree made the experience rich for everyone, and I suspect it was important to the success of the program. At our multiple institutions, there was no curricular expectation that we would be away from campus. Each student independently sought opportunity, or Randall dragged us away. Cornell had no foreign program, so I went looking elsewhere, and I dragged other students with me. The studio was in an apartment away from the Villarosa, without dedicated architecture staff, no one close by, and we were left pretty much to our own devices. Because a single studio was a small group that could move somewhat efficiently, field trips often meant piling into a van driven by Professor Corman. Sometimes we were on trains. Once we traveled by thumb. That was as a result of a strike. And there was a real sense of adventure and discovery. We, I think, saw ourselves as navigators of our own kind of lives there and our educations. I don't remember being given handouts with drawings and written histories before field trips. We never were assigned reading material, and there were no pre-trip lectures. The trips were without burden attached, and we did have a real sense of freedom to move about. That doesn't negate that they were planned to a large degree, but it felt like we were in there. Though by current measure, the lack of preparation may seem without academic structure, the looser framework shifted responsibility to the students to observe, to ask questions, to actively engage, really in their own learning, and we took it pretty seriously. The objective was to draw as a result of observation, to understand by drawing, to experience the culture of place, and to translate those experiences and architectural models in studio production. The elaborate handouts, pre-field trip lectures, and presentations came later, but by the time I got there as a faculty member, the lectures were forgotten history. And as soon as we could, Larry and I made the decision to eliminate most of the handout building documentation because students were not really making an effort to construct drawings as a result of what they saw in front of them. We did provide urban plans and settled on pre-trip reading as a means of constructing a basic understanding of urban and architectural history. But the readings were not burdensome and allowed more for discovery on site. Reading summaries were tickets to the bus. But what mattered more, and what we discovered rather quickly, and I think rediscovered, was that having historians with us on site to give short talks and to answer questions was much more engaging and meaningful. So as a student, having Giorgio Ciucci with us, who also, as Randall was talking about, taught the history class, to explain Rome was really extraordinary. Many years later, Ciucci joined us a few times on tours of the EUR. These are his handouts, not ours. And those were memorable discussions. Charles Ewell, a real deal archaeologist, was with us at Pompeii and Paestum. In Torino, we found historians of Guarini, Ibarra, and Nervi to explain structure and space over 3 centuries. And the field trips got to be thematic often in those ways. On those days, students paid close attention. The goal of field trips has not substantially changed over 40 years, but the increase in number of students shifts the sense of adventure and unpredictability, I think. And for many students, an active responsibility for one's own education. The more exposed, less insulated environment, when I was a student, also resulted in most of us learning Italian, at least to some extent. Something that it's interesting because I think that the access to the culture through learning a language anywhere is something that stays with you forever. And in many cases, that changed our lives. Okay, so what I really want to talk about is 30 years later, when by the time Larry and I got there in the fall of 2007. The curriculum really had not changed much. I think that's a real testament to its durability and its flexibility. Since its inception, so studio, field trip course, Italian architectural history, and Italian language. But the program had, of course, grown up, and the administrative machine was well-oiled. We had permanent studios at Donatello, offices, small library, incredibly useful, a growing urban plan collection, computers that worked most of the time, not all the time. The absence of plotters, laser cutters, and mills forced students to use more rudimentary tools and materials, often to great advantage. They probably don't think so, but some really great stuff came out. So what distinguished my tenure in Florence were annual international workshops that Francisco Sinin, Larry Davis, and I collectively organized. First in 2008, and that I expanded in the following 3 years. Though there had been small collaborative efforts, Ted mentioned one, in previous generations, they were not pursued with the kind of consistency that marked the years of the late 2010s. In many ways, the workshops were methodologically an extension of the work of the design center that I directed here, but the mission was altogether different. We conceived them as an opportunity to work with students throughout Europe, our own kind of little Erasmus, with annual events that positioned the program not only as Italian, but one that was European, that offered students and faculty both the occasion to meet and work with colleagues throughout the EU. It was an opportunity for Syracuse students to expand their understanding of other academic models and to establish relationships with students of multiple nationalities, with colleagues whose interests and concerns they shared, and to understand differences in approach to problems of the city and architectural design. The collaborations necessitated a lingua franca of freehand drawing, though many students could adequately converse in English. The Dutch, of course, are embarrassingly fluent, and dual language students operated as translators. In 2008, Francisco Sinin collaborated with Juan Herreros, Larry Davis, some work from his studio, ran a workshop in Arezzo, and I ran one in Corleone, Sicily, of Godfather renown, where the only anti-mafia center in the country is located without the involvement of, we did that without the involvement of other institutions. In the following 3 years, I'm going to go through these rather quickly. I organized workshops in collaboration with UA, that's the architecture school in Venice, TU Delft, the École Nationale Supérieure de Nancy, and I am not going to say this because I'll butcher this, but other schools in France, the University of Pisa, and the University of Florence. In 2011, all studios, this was in Venice, we were looking at both culture and kind of industry and mestre. In 2011, all 3 studios at Syracuse participated in reimagining 3 sites in Cisa, a small town outside of Florence. In the year I left, after the year I left, Larry organized a workshop in Madrid. The themes and sizes of the projects varied from the very large, how to manage the growth of a small town. These are still in Venice. This is in Cisa. To the very small urban theater on a site left vacant by World War II bombardment. In all cases, the explorations were more or less real, but the expectation for production was that work was exploratory, and the goal was to shift thinking. The workshops were unique opportunities, not only to engage international student teams, but to learn about the history of Europe and of Italy, engage in local administrative political debate, understand urban landscape and architectural concerns. And they were introductions to local culture and people that otherwise would have been difficult to access. We were invited into the council chambers of city halls, met with mayors of small towns, introduced to mafia history and its local control in a town of 100 churches, to the practices of ancient Roman farming and global industrial economies in the 20th century around the Venetian lagoon, not the usual Venetian history. As well as also the legacy of World War II, its still present scars, both urban and emotional, 21st century economic development issues, climate concerns, and the always present problem of how to manage an important urban and architectural patrimony in the context of contemporary culture and technology. And we were fed always an opportunity to learn about local gastronomic traditions, an engine of Italian identity. So working in these contexts outside of established studios, often in provisional setups like this one that you see in Cisa, was challenging, but put everyone on their A game. The unexpected, unplanned, and sometimes improvisational generated invention and individual investment. The workshops piqued the interest of local journalists and citizens who attended end of charrette presentations. We held press conferences, mounted exhibitions, and the work of Mestre in Mestre and San Miniato Tedesco resulted in publications. This one over here. Okay, that was brief description of the workshops. We did that once a year in the spring, and in the fall, because those students didn't have the opportunity to participate in the workshops, we tried to do other things. In an effort really to get students out of the studio to meet colleagues in the same way that they did in the more formal workshops, we twice held an installation competition in collaboration with Andrea Ponzi, contributions to an exhibition he imagined curating as part of a broad program for his entry courtyard that preceded his studio. Our goal was to give students opportunity to conceive of, design, and construct work at full scale, deploying a minimal material palette of 4-meter copper pipes and courtyard gravel. As many of you know, Andrea has access to lots of copper tubing. The family business produces bathroom fixtures, but what held Andrea's attention for a long time was the stuff inside of the wall that was all behind the sinks and tubs. He used available copper tubes to make furniture, radiators, and light fixtures. But as he reached the end of this phase of his work, he had about 70 tubes hanging around his studio and provided students with the opportunity to construct installations that would change the spatial understanding and program of his garden. So these are 3 different proposals by students that were built. The only 2 rules were that tubes could neither be bent or damaged, nor fastened. The construction schedules were quick, a maximum of 2 days. Syracuse and Kent State students contributed to the project in alternating semesters. And the Kent State students were invited, this is construction, were invited to our kind of post-construction parties. Andrea had a fit because he thought that these bent tubes would be broken forever. We had these celebrations at the end. Over 2 semesters, Syracuse students built 7 or 8 versions of the pipe garden, some quite inventive. Okay, so why Italy and why Florence? Randall can best speak about the importance of the Florence program to curricular goals when it was established. But as I reconstruct the experience, the intention was, I think, to study a city that contributed to an understanding of a particular brand of urban architecture. Ted talked about that. The city of Brunelleschi and Vasari of Italian Renaissance landscape tradition, and to be dipped in a culture of Renaissance humanism, of an important Western artistic, literary, and scientific production. As the program grew, Syracuse faculty, already familiar with the School of Architecture curriculum and pedagogy, chiseled away at the Florence program neatly in ways to fit into what the school at the mothership here in Syracuse was doing. And with the annual publication of Folio, thank you, Ted, for including that, the school community, including alumni and a population outside the school, understood what was happening in Florence, at least generally. And I think it's important to kind of just mention that Folio went out all across the United States and allowed really everyone in the US to understand what we were doing here. As the architecture curriculum has evolved, the relationship between the off-campus programs, including Florence, and the core, is less tightly knitted to the pedagogy, I think. And there seems to have, the program seem to have an independent logic, loosely aligned more with the history of the program itself than what specifically we are always doing here. The importance of the off-campus programs to the identity of the school as offering students opportunity to engage in the world and to expand disciplinary knowledge is without doubt. But their specific role in the larger curricular framework is not as clear as they once were, leaving each director to redefine the program in new ways. And I think it's I would like to talk about that later, because I think it's really important as we move forward. So to return to Florence and humanism, the architecture of urbanity of the Renaissance, the city of Brunelleschi and Vasari. It has a lot to teach us, as does so much of 20th century Italian architecture. In the 4 years that I was in Florence, I think, including those years just before and after, we conceived of the program's foundations and lessons as having roots in the city of Italy, and with a continental reach that pushed at and challenged students to translate and interpret fundamental lessons of the world around them. The workshops were just the beginning. I'm done.
She was showing the sign for 2 minutes. She kept holding up and you didn't say it. Okay, you put that on there. I got negative tests yesterday. Good. Testing. Whoa. So we'll only open the first slide, right? Well, oh, good. So I'll start while the slides are coming up. There we go. Thank you. I'm really impressed and amazed with the presentations of my colleagues. I'm having a hard time speaking today. With the presentations of my colleagues, and I only wish that I had seen them earlier so I could have adjusted some of the content that I have that might double and triple and quadruple what's been said, and other content that might be completely off base. But I've got quite an education today, and it makes me think that, as Liz said, this is long overdue, because there's incredible amount of invaluable information that we can all learn from about not only the history of this little program, but more importantly, I think about ideas and ideals and mechanisms and approaches and values about architectural education, which is really the critical issue here. So I'm going to run through too many slides. Can I get my 2-minute warning now? I'm going to need it. But I'm going to share a couple of thoughts first. The idea that Randall started with the row stuff is important, not because we want to bow down to Roe or anyone else, but that idea that historical model, which has been articulated by everyone here in a number of different ways, that historical model has value, has incredible value in the production of an architecture that looks to itself to grow and evolve, is an idea that I think is not in this school or not in any school, but just in general is eroding in contemporary society, especially in contemporary architectural education. And my whole presentation, I think, fundamentally is about challenging that misconception and misperception that the value of looking at things that are old has at least been reduced. And for the other 2,000 years, it was a good idea. But somewhere between 1980 and 2010, we decided that we were in a special time in society and that we should only be looking at the things related to our contemporary issues. I'm quite sure the Industrial Revolution, the X-ray, the wheel and fire, those time periods felt similarly about that. And I look at the Italian Renaissance very, very closely. It's what I taught when I was there, and I learned a great deal about it when I was there. And at the same time, my work on Coolhouse is fueled by my student-based and educator-based study of that old work. How those people and architects looked at and analyzed that work became the foundation for looking at any work. And I think that's a critical point for us to make. And this is all off script stuff. So I'm going to share a couple of points. And one other thing before I go on to my paragraphs here. Randall mentioned this Prix Nouveau and this and that. One of the reasons that I'm so, I think, intensely and passionately committed to this idea of disciplinary knowledge is because I keep seeing lectures and hearing references to all of these architectures and architects that we assume we know and our students know, and society doesn't know them. I won't go into the statistics right now, but I introduced my third-year students 12 weeks away from graduating from our architectural core to the Unité the other day. And it was one of those situations where I said, well, you know it. When I show you the picture, you'll know it. You're just not good with names. And I showed them and I went through the whole thing. None of them had ever heard of it. And I know that we teach it in history and I know we teach these things in systems, but I think that we are losing that value. So it's always been understood that the Italians bore a much heavier burden of their own history than many other cultural contexts felt. And as such, their Darwinian transformation from Roman to medieval to Renaissance to Baroque and modern versions of Italian architecture are more heavily saturated and governed by the lessons and frameworks of their architectural past to some extent. Unlike other Western contexts, at least, where the weight of ancestry does not typically operate as the helicopter parent of architectural oversight, at least not in the ways that it has in the unique context of the anomalous peninsula that became Italy almost 170 years ago. I mention this because the uniqueness of the political, cultural, geographic, and architectural characteristics of places as diverse from each other as Rome, Venice, Sicily, and Milano, almost separate countries, and they were separate territories, separate city-states, et cetera, until they were unified on some level and always warring with each other. That contrast is precisely what makes this place such a fertile and ideal context for the study of architecture, past, present, and especially future. We don't go to Italy to develop an antiquated approach to architecture. We go to Italy to learn how to read, to learn how to decipher and experience and analyze, to evolve our ability to more deeply comprehend the relationship between urban contexts and the evolution of historical type, the translation of these lessons through filters of each contemporary age, and to understand, and this is why the in situ site study is so important, and we do understand this, and to understand the less tangible cultural impact on the development of an architectural ethos, language, and values. On one of the points that was given to us by Daniele and Julia, on influence, I have one more sentence to share here before we dive into too many slides. On influence, the note I made here, it says, because of the context that we are provided, I was not so bold or arrogant to presume that I had the authority to challenge the responsibilities of a lineage and of a history that was provided to us, and is precisely that history that confirms Italy, not necessarily Florence, but Italy as the locus of our architectural study. On some level, nothing has changed. So this will forward. I was a student in '86 under some other educators that were mentioned by Randall. I had a history class with Colin Rowe, which was interesting. We did these kind of composite synthetic typological studies. I was the director of the program for 4 years after that, sometime after that, from 2012 to 2016. And in a very simple way, I'd like to just loosely look at the questions. What did we do? What did we study? What did we learn? What did we change? And what was important to us? Some of this would have changed after hearing my colleagues' great presentations. One thing we didn't try to do, especially with the analytical approach that we took, is to not see Italy as in some sort of romantic or nostalgic, through a lens of romantic or the nostalgic, to copy it, to mimic it, or anything similar to that. The study of the history of architecture and urban form is the foundational act in the development of a deep, rhetorical, and advanced architecture. This is a position, not a fact. An architecture built on the timeless lessons of the cultural, contextual, formal, and material elements of architecture. We posit the idea, and this is what we did while I was there, so I'm going to speak only to those years because I can't speak for the years before me or after. We posit the idea that the making of a progressive architecture for the future is the result of passing the lessons of the continuum of the cultural production of architecture through the filter and lens of contemporary society. It is always a marriage of joining and compromise between those two. Looking backward and looking forward in a continuously vacillating act of temporal interplay is essential in building the intellectual framework for an architecture that is deadly serious about the importance of its existence and the requisite disciplinary expertise. Our focus was on analysis, was on the urban context, was on space, and it says small, medium, large, extra large in micro font intentionally, and on precedent. And the relationships between these and what developing an awareness and a comprehension of these things could do in terms of informing design work. I had a moment when I realized in my first semester there, I was on site and I was referencing my notes from Murray. We called it Murray back then, the Architecture of the Italian Renaissance by Murray. And I realized that I was explaining the quality of one building in relationship to the quality of another building because Murray had written that and I was reading it. And I thought to myself, what's wrong with this picture? What's wrong with me? What expertise and understanding did I lack as a professor in this context to be able to tell the students how and or why one thing was more qualitative than another? What did Murray have on me? What did he have that I didn't have? And it caused me to, while I was there, reassess how to look at the work, how to study the work, and how to teach the work. And it produced, for me, a massive transformation in terms of how I think we delivered the content. And the reason we did this was to develop a literacy, to know what the heck we are looking at in a deeper way than in a kind of a first glance way. Talk about some of these things quickly here. First of all, I was really fortunate to work with incredible colleagues while I was there. Obviously, Ted and Ann, we have some great visitors, Rebecca and Ilka Voni, incomparable Marissa Tyrone and Andreas Duriva. So I think that's everyone that I taught with when I was there. And a lot of what I learned had as much to do with working with these people than did everything else. And then I also worked with the MVP, Luca Miles Ponzi, who's there now. And I think with the shifts in the staffing models that we have, where we have non-Syracuse School of Architecture faculty teaching in the program exclusively, I think that Luca's value to the program, the continuum and the disciplinary expertise that he provides is incredibly important. And I learned, again, probably more from him than anyone while I was there, except for Murray, of course. I don't know if we'd show facilities, so I thought I'd show a little bit here. There we see the villa. We see A is where our building is. For those of you that don't know, the art building, we worked very closely with the art faculty and art schedule, which I'll talk about in a moment. The little tiny piece is the printmaking studio. A lot of our students took printmaking courses and did their drawings as etchings. You see Villarosa, and I would say the sacred cubic garden that sits in there, and then Savonarola and his unfortunate past. There's the 59 building that Randall talked about. Interestingly, when I was there, I had a final review behind that window. And I don't know, normally you want to apologize for saying this, but in today's context, Colin Rowe was on my final review there, and it was the only good review I think I got while I was an undergrad, because they were all bad then. So it was a bright moment. The incredible garden in the back. And we used this garden for a series of architectural design projects while I was there. I think for at least 2 semesters, we did extensions of Syracuse University and each student developed their own thesis as a center for debate, as a school of government, as an art school, as a theater school, et cetera. So we did incredible things to this garden, the library. Some other quick things here. When I was there, I made up this name, Donatello Biblioteca Pubblico. We took all the books that I remember Bruce Coleman used to always rave about being hidden away in a closet that no human had ever seen, except for faculty. And we decided to put them all down here and make a library space out of the glass table room. And it was amazing. Students don't want books, they don't own books, they don't steal books, and they certainly can't take books on an airplane because of the weight restrictions. So we have an entire library of incredibly valuable books that no one touches except that they use them, and they're always on the tables. That was a real plus. And we also created this. When I got there, I remember hearing from Larry that this was the lecture room for some of the events. And I thought, you know, there are dungeons where people are punished. We shouldn't have our lectures in there, but students had no model facilities, and we were very hands-on. So we turned this into a functioning model studio with storage space, foam cutters, et cetera. And I looked at the curriculum. We looked at the curriculum a little bit, and we saw a glitch in this calendar. From seeing my colleagues' calendars, I realized we didn't increase the quantity of travel time very much, but we did do these things. Oops, shoot. We did add a 4th day to these big trips, and 4 days is 32 days too short. But we were able to work with the Italian courses for the students to be able to go longer for those trips. But we shifted studio days so that our schedule and the fine art studio schedule were not overlapping, but integrated. So then we had a lot of students able to take sculpture, painting, printmaking, and drawing courses outside of architecture. And they were very interested in that, which prompted that shift. And then a lot of the other days you see here are there are trips, there are programming, et cetera, which we'll talk about. So this is my slide that talks about that collaboration between art and architecture. And then we had exhibitions that I'll show that we always did with the art program. So these are some of the exhibitions at the end of the semester every year. I think this continues and was there before I got there for those years. We'd have a differently themed exhibition. So we'd have here exhibitions in the library. They were well appointed with chocolates and other kinds of foods and flowers. This was the one that I really appreciated, where there was a flood of drawings from the students that filled up this teaching space, review space with the drawings of, I think that was the first semester there. We had a robust lecture series and left a kind of a mark on the wall with this as a kind of graphic imprint was there, and a symposium at the end of my time there. But Arc 571 is really, I think, what the prompt was to talk about a bit. And our focus on analysis, and I think that, Randall already articulated this so clearly, that we made pictorial drawings and we made drawings that recorded the actual situation, plan, section, and perspective, but we also really focused on analytical, cutaway, dissecting, conceptual drawings. And that's an invaluable experience. We had a moment, those are the itineraries from when I got there in 1986 as a child. We had a moment in front of Fontana, the fountain on the top of the Ginicolo. I can't remember the name of it now. And we're drawing, and Frank Ching from the famous books, Aquapala, Kirikati. And a guy comes over and says, "What are you guys doing?" We're drawing, we're showing him the drawings. And he said, "I'm Frank Ching." And the kids gathered around like it was Bon Jovi in the 80s. And it was really funny. He looked at all the drawings. They're all showing him the drawings, and as well, they're analytical. I was like, "Frank, baby, what do you think? Of course they're analytical. What do you think we're doing?" It was a joke. But it was great because he was so surprised at how analytical our approach was to the work. And we were learning some of the things from his basic books. So these itineraries then became these when we were there. We did probably what Liz probably didn't like. We added tons of information. We did a lot of lectures. We overly saturated the students with content, but then pushed an incredible quantity of on-site lecturing and analysis when we were there. So they weren't allowed to rely on doing the thing we don't want them to do, which is to copy the stuff. How much time do I have, Julia? Just getting started. So I'm going to skip these pieces, I think, because I'm not going to read through these, but the influences, I will say this one, the architectural context of Florence and Italy. I think I've already made my case that what is there is why we are there. And I like to think that 2,000 years ago, work from 2000, was there 2,000 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 500 years ago, and 50 years ago. All of those periods, that work was there when we started the program. It hasn't changed, and it's still there. If we were talking about the Basil Caracalla in Rome, San Vitale in Ravenna, the Laurentian Library, that work is all there, and we went there to study that work. So I think we may have a discussion on our hands about is it still relevant to study that work, or we may not have that discussion, but I want to make the case. It hasn't changed, and I don't think that we as a discipline, not as a school, but as a discipline, want to shift away from those kinds of studies. The models, literally pedagogy. So these are some of the things we did. And I'm going to show some student work in a rapid fire. When I get the 2-minute warning, I'm just going to fly through the student work because I overloaded with work, and I thought that might be a nice way to end this, just to see some of the kinds of things that we did. But this was one of the final projects for 571. We made a series of those models. And we did all kinds of projects in the urban environment, insane ones, sensitive ones, contextual ones, bold ones, polemical ones, et cetera. This was a hotel and casino on the Campidoglio. This is the first sketch. You'll see things that are more carefully constructed. So in these 3 categories, obviously the Florentine and Tuscan and Italian context of great kind of historic architectural models. We also considered and looked at every opportunity we could, any significant modern and contemporary works. And Chris Gray, he was former director of the program in 85 and 86. He was the director when I was there. And I think those of you that know Chris know that he was obsessively invested in the models of analysis that I'm talking about. So while I was a student, he was there. And then Wilvin was my studio instructor, and that foundation was provided and then lay dormant until I got there and had my Murray moment. But that was an influence. And then I put these architects up here because I think each one of these, we can make a very clear, strong case for each of them building on their own interest in and comprehension of the histories of architecture. The one anecdote I will tell is when I was at the American Academy, I got called to a dinner at the last minute the night that Zaha won the Maxi competition. And I was privileged to sit in a room with 4 people, she, I, and 2 other people. And for 4 hours, she held court talking about exactly what you'd expect her to talk about. A lot of old dead architecture from the 17th, 18th, 19th, and some 20th century. She even got up to the Russians. And it was shocking to think of this person who we held up as the most progressive visionary on some levels. We understand her this way now, but that back in 99, we may not have seen her that way. So I do this, some of you have seen this, but I didn't want to take these 4 slides out. This idea of history, Elvis used the blues and country to make rock. Lennon used Elvis and the blues to make rock. Zeppelin used Lennon and the blues to make rock. And what do we do now? Hitchcock has become Marvel, Beethoven has become Bieber. And what are we doing in architecture as an analogy? And it's not an architectural question, it's a societal one, but I think it's an important one. So there are too many of these, but see, there's some of the reasons we go: the tombs, temples, houses, spaces, details, syntactical conditions, material conditions, typological conditions. I'll say one thing about 2 slides here. This and this would not happen. Michelucci would not be playing the games of pilaster and structure and expression and suppression, all the different kinds of structure, if he had not had the lessons that he could be able to extract from architects like Michelangelo here. Even the coplanarity and then contrasting planarity and chromatic similarity and chromatic contrast, all of that plays out in architects like Michelucci and especially in Turani. So, I mean, does that ceiling and that ceiling have anything in common? And I know we know these lessons, but I want to make the case for some of these pieces, right? 2 minutes, great. I love this image. So some of the stuff that's there that we want to continue to invest more deeply in. Houses, and this is Michelucci again in the same building, better photos. And this is more something than I think we can even think of doing today. Details like this. On pedagogies, we invested deeply in the idea of urban and the idea of architecture and the idea of urban architecture and the scales of spaces and contextual responses as they related to things like typology, as they related to the immediate context, as they related to the cultural context of an area, and as they related, I said precedent? To a precedent for a project. I give this quiz every semester. It's 100 slides, and it's coffee table book stuff, from Einstein Tower to Castelfascia. I've had students, this is where my concern is. get a 99 on this quiz. Somebody got a 99 on this, which is remarkable. They got 99 wrong. And it was just a shocker to me. This person is in an elite graduate school right now. But a lot of people will only get 90 wrong. And this is not obscure stuff. So it raises, so when I was there, the investment in these urban relationships, I developed some ideas about what we might argue could be essential foundations for a new treatise on the future and antiquity fused together. We did projects embedded in the city. We invested in analysis. And I want to run through, and then there was a lot of at the desk work where my drawings and students' drawings went back and forth. And I think some of you know some of these, but I'm going to just run through. So the outcomes, I'm going to run through some works now to finish up for the last 60 seconds. These are big, big, big urban projects. This might be Rose's site below around the gasometer on the south side in Trastevere. This is a prison and a housing complex and a city hall and cultural facilities. This is the work that leads up to that. Just to give you a sense, this is the Villarosa Project. Each one of these, one obviously did a student union, chess club courtyard, very sensitively done projects. The one on the left is a Piranesi tomb where the fountain has been translated into a spiraling ink well. And these kinds of studies where the city is studied to produce some kinds of assumptions about how one might operate, maybe like Super Studio did, or some of those kinds of architects at that point. I think there's a great deal of sophistication in some of these projects, but I more want to show you the processes here, the ways working by hand, working digitally, making models, working loosely, working broadly. This is a pretty interesting idea that the connections, that's what we're doing in third year now, about flows and connections in a different way. It doesn't deal with the ecology. And then go through, you can get a sense here of a Florence program. And then we'll finish, and this is one student, and I eliminated 40 pages of his work. And that's Syracuse University in Florence next to the train station. We did that one semester, a remarkable project, a figure ground that looks like it was born out of Roma and Entorota, and he could have taught a few things, I think, to those, maybe 30 more seconds, Julia. And this was from Anne Munley's studio, a beautiful project that rethinks the city along the water's edge. This is Professor Min, who I don't think is in the room. And I just want to finish with the spatial, a mosque in Bologna. These are handmade models in Florence. No digital, no renderings. A pagan temple in Bologna, a GUI model. This is the martyred Saint Sebastian as a chapel. And then the last part, and this is great, a house of the falling meteorite. And there are obviously incredibly, I think, powerful urban ideas and architectural ideas about the context in these projects, but I want to end with analysis. It's not a drawing course. It's an analysis course. It's about content and intellectual frameworks. So I won't explain these. I think you know how these drawings work, but they are varied across the spectrum of how to study a thing and a place, from the most broad scale to the most detailed scale, and museums. This is the last part. And then we did these models, studying facade and studying space, carved space. So the students went away with, this is the end, something. We're at the Villa Rotunda, which my students can't identify. And I think we're at a really important moment, I think, to talk about the program and the future of architectural education. We have an opportunity and a responsibility to find a way to be next and to do, I think, what we do so well and have done so well. Thanks. Thanks.
It's going to take 10 minutes while we connect to Florence and the other presentation. No, I want a copy. I think we should go. I think we should go. Okay. So we're going to move forward with the, I'll say the last of the decades, but it's really the future. And it's welcome, Daniele. Thank you for staying up and joining us. And everyone, Daniele Profeta.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm really sad not to be able to be there in person, but I'm also humbled to be able to participate in such a milestone of the program. You know, it's a big statement to say that I'm going to talk about the future. So I'm just going to try to suggest some of the few things that I've been thinking about in the last 3 semesters, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation afterwards. I also want to thank Julia and Michael for, first of all, the opportunity to be here, and then for supporting this event, which, like many have said so far, is really exciting to, and so I'm very honored to be able to do this with all of you. I also want to give a shout out to my students here. They were, which screen can you see? No, the wrong one. Give me a second. Sorry, let me do this again. I want to share the other screen. Okay. Okay, great. So I wanted to give also a shout out to my students, which were until 5 minutes ago in studio, looking at the live streaming of the show, of the symposium, that really made this semester possible, and really excitable. So together with them, I also want to thank the team, the SU Florence architecture team, which some of the spaces might have resonated in the other slides. But really, it's an incredible group of people. Some that stayed for us with a little bit longer, like Jennifer and Jane Zaloga, or new incoming instructors like Olivier Desmarais, Irene Piano, and Cecilia Lundback that joined us all the way from Sweden. And especially in this last 3 semesters, I really could have not even thought of running this program without the incredible help from the SU Florence team in general. There were an immense support for the construction of the logistics, the safety, as well as the support in the structuring of the pedagogies with these new protocols that were set in place. So I want to start the presentation with this quote from a book. It's called Glitch Feminism from 2020. That I think really helps to ground the kind of influences for this decade, or really 3 years or 2 years that I've been working here, both in terms of a general cultural milieu, but also in terms of my own trajectory as I moved to Florence. And so really, the ambition here is to start thinking about how do we operate in a digital era, how do we still come together in solidarity to think about the built environment and our role in it as designer. And this was ever more relevant as my first experience here in Florence was really in Rome, running a completely online abroad study during the fall of 2020, where we were able in a course of 2 semesters to go from this immersive digital platforms where our community was built through sort of shared infrastructure of Zoom screens, separating our private space of our own bedrooms and working spaces with a space of education, all the way to a fantastic spring 21, where the background became the backdrop of an in-person hybrid review, where we were really sort of challenging the opportunities that this digital infrastructure that made all of those online semester possible could continue to extend and open up the possibilities for this semester. Because as you can see, we're all still very much used to this format. And so when I was thinking about influences in the backdrop of my architectural residence here, really this is more of a foreground, and thinking about the pandemic, the global pandemic, and how it's dramatically changed the built environment and the way that we have begun to occupy it. Take, for example, these photographs taken in the plaza of the Duomo of Milano. This is a public space that is meant to engage with the public sphere of the city, to facilitate the aggregation of large volumes of people to celebrate and protest, to develop a shared discourse. And so today, in a protest against some of the missteps of the public administration, public health administration, the plaza is populated through this idea of what we have been defining as distributed proximity, the idea of being together, but at a distance. And so this conceptual framework that perhaps became very helpful to talk about sort of the spatial relationship that exists between individuals across digital rooms, not unlike this Zoom room that we're currently inhabiting right now, at least myself and many others, begins to be understood as a mediated space across which negotiating ideas of privateness and publicness become ever more fundamental. A mediation that now extends beyond the space of the screen, all the way to the physical mask that we began to wear as part of a social contract to support the welfare of a larger community. Protocol of distancing and movement that structure the way we exist with others. And so what has surfaced more evidently is the presence of an ubiquitous digital sensitive infrastructure measuring individual temperatures or archiving body heat temperatures to monitor rituals of movement in the space of the city. This, of course, is not something new at all, definitely not something of the 2020s, but rather is something that has been accelerated both in the public discourse and in the kind of physical presence in the last few months or year, let's say. And traces this sort of longer evolution can certainly be found, for example, at the OMA show at the Guggenheim, New York, that was opened in spring of 2019, where under the title of Countryside, the Future, begin to already sort of lay out a fantastic frame of reference to think about how the necessity of modern urban life, its densities and accesses, had already necessitated the reorganization, abstraction, and automation of the countryside at an unprecedented scale. A countryside that, to support the welfare of the city, has engaged with digital monitoring and military logistics to restructure its fundamental operating logic. Among other sites that they looked at, they of course focus on the space of agriculture, where environmental concerns, together with an ever-growing demand for content, have transformed the image of what once pastoral landscape in an expanding field of automated production. Something that I would argue also happened in the Chianti region. But nevertheless, the tension between cities, which have received significant attention in recent scholarship, and countryside was also at the base of an exhibition focused on rural development of China's immense countryside. For example, the show called Building a Future Countryside, and created by Liu Shunlong at the Venice Biennale of 2018, investigated how such development could combine modernization with tradition in what they call a non-vernacular way. And so if current countryside discourse is polarized between attempts to keep everything as is or to change everything altogether, this show, for me, was very relevant to begin to depict the countryside through a series of possible lenses to outline future trajectories, space for opportunity to negotiate future development. Within the Italian context, Stefano Boeri Architects research, which many of you may know for the Bosco Verticale in Milan, in Racing here are also focused on this tension, analyzing the figure of the Borgo, which you'll see is very sort of central to our group, which in Italy refers to sort of this inhabited center of medium size, which historically sort of is supported by both artisanal commerce and a peripheral sort of primarily dedicated to agriculture. And the idea here is to think about the widespread network of small inhabited communities across the entire Italian peninsula as a central site of design to restructure the balance of the built environment amidst health, social, and environmental crisis, which of course in the last few years has been responded or engaged with in the public with a lot of protests, especially addressing some of the measures the government put in place, both in the space of the pandemic and the post-pandemic sort of economic rebounds. Protests that sort of had a stretch between issues of environmental justice in conjunction with the broader response to the Black Lives Matter movement, as it expanded after the brutal killing by police of George Floyd on the 25th of May of 2020. And so what it emerged more clearly in this conversation is a discourse that highlights the disproportionate and systematic inequalities, both racial and economic, that are embedded within many of our institutions and infrastructures, and the need for structural change rather than small-scale techno fixes. And so from this perspective of architecture education, we have begun to see an attempt to revise the Bauhaus and other teaching models of that period. They were accepted and adopted as sort of standard modernizing pedagogies, while overlooking the people that were excluded from these same learning experiences. And so looking at the manifesto, which I really encourage all of the students in the room to take a look at, of anti-racist architecture education by Architecture, was an incredible source of inspiration also in the lecture that they gave here in Florence a few weeks ago, last semester, to ask if we are a discipline as architecture that preaches the possibility of making new worlds together, what worlds can be created under the framework of exclusionary pedagogical models. And so in the program, we're attempting to engage with scholarship that problematizes model of exclusion as they appear within the Italian landscape, both historically and in its contemporary reality. Particularly important to understand for me in this context is Italy as a country that has been transformed in the 1990s from a country of an immigrant export to a key immigrant destination from people from Africa, Latin America, Central and Eastern Europe. And while it is easy to sort of perceive a certain lack of language in the public sphere to address a conversation over racial discrimination, a lot of new research has been developing, like the work of Eder Merrill, which is here on the slide, which also lectured here a few weeks ago, whose work sort of aims to erase the sort of fictional border between Africa and Europe that is created both in public discourse and in the historical narratives when we continue to position Italy as an isolated cradle of Western civilization. In her work, which is titled Who Gets to Be Italian, she really unpacks fantastically these historical trajectories, highlighting their continuous presence as a justification for anti-immigration sentiments, as well as outspoken racist practices in contemporary Italy. And so with this in mind, not merely trying to sort of fix anything, but we're sort of trying to start thinking about ways in which the Italian built environment could be leveraged as a part of this sort of repositioning of architectural pedagogies through three lenses in which we'll try to sort of unfold the next 3 years of my stay here. Sorry, the next 1.5 years, but 3 years total of my stay here. So you'll see this is sort of the overall progression. We did 1 semester completely online and 3 semester hybrid. And so there are three sort of 1 year long research themes that I'm setting in place, one on Borgo Digitale, Digital Borgo, the Bonifica, land reclamation, and one on Italian islands. And so I want to kind of go through these three to see kind of the setup for the conversation. So I'm going to start with the Borgo Digitale. So in this first year of the program, we focus on the relationship between countryside and urban environments, highlighting the distributed network of the Italian Borgo as a fertile site of intervention to renegotiate historical identities with global values. And so what we focused on was the transforming character of domestic space, in which ideas of public and privateness are continuously negotiated through the contested typology of the house. And so we looked at kind of the work of Aldo Rossi. We sort of engaged with this extensive typological survey of the Canton Ticino to articulate an idea of typology in relationship to the natural and sort of built environment of that region. Students in our course sort of engage with the idea of the frictionalized space of modern housing as part of a sort of a larger biopolitical project where subjects can be clearly individuated and in turn easily managed within the idea of sort of modern housing and modern housing typology. And this is especially clear in public depiction of the domestic space in the advertisement of Mulino Bianco, which for all of you that have been in Italy, oh, well, I guess you also in its international reach, highlighting sort of the space of the house and its contested typology in the way that sort of begins to highlight systemic oppression on the basis of gender, race, and class. And so while all of this was happening, this was a course that was being taught completely online. And so really the first 2 semesters, one of the main questions was to start thinking about how to structure an online program. This should be a video. There you go. A broad program was very important. How can we engage with these sites while not being there, while being at a distance? And again, like I said in the very first slide, to try and continue to develop ways to come together even through these digital platforms. And so the difficulty of engaging with the site at a distance while also considering its opportunities in developing perhaps a broader discourse on intercultural experience. are we always at a distance from this site, even when we're there in person? Can we acknowledge the individual unstable grounds upon which each student stands when engaging with an external site? And so we worked with remote sensing and digital scanning as a way to capture fragments of this site, of this territory, that were then provided to students, asking them to put the site back together, to try and build partial narratives of the area of investigation rather than being given solid imaginaries of what these sites are meant to tell them. And so the students in those semesters, this is the work of Jasmine and Kelsey, started thinking about the ideas, for example, of co-housing and the idea of producing intergenerational housing community, nestling within the space of this borgo, taking advantage of sort of these partial fragments of the city fabric and trying to fill in the blanks with their own representation and their own programmatic and spatial interpretations. Or the work of Skylar and Rachel, where they started on a fantastic project called Flesh Cultures, where they started to analyze the role of meat cultures or alternative meat cultures in the space of Chianti, precisely. And then finally, the work of UG, Camille, and Andrea, which starting from a deep analysis of the space of the bathroom and the kind of mediatic space that it produces, as it produces a relationship between the private self, individual bodies, and the media of the city. So this was our first 2 semester on the Borghi, in this very strange setup where students were never able to have direct access to the site for many, many reasons. And this semester instead, we started a new research on the space of the Bonifica, a year in which we will turn to the territorial as well as the ideological space of the Bonifica, which loosely translate as land reclamation, where patterns of territorial reclamation are confronted with parallel fascist ideologies that radically reconfigured the cultural landscape of the 20th century. And so when you see the translation of a word like bonificare, you realize how tight the relationship exists between sort of ideas of land management and the associated value system they're required to support them, ideas of suitability and productivity as sort of like just a few of the parameters that underpin these interventions. And so we're very interested in thinking about the way in which modern historiography articulated a separation between 2 different agents within this territories, the space of the bucolos, or the sort of savage bandit, which despite the sort of literary genre of the bucolic poetry with this peacefulness and stillness of life, as some sort of nostalgic return to a pre-modern period, was really depicted as uncivilized, quote unquote, uncivilized culture. While on the other side, we have the space of agriculture as the only, once again, civilized usage of territory. A world that begins to be dominated by the desire to control the territory following a very rational structure. And so what is at play here in these territories that we're working with is the identification of agriculture with civilization, leaving marshlands as an element to be eradicated. And so we're working with the space of hydrological instability, like in the space of the Agropontino, even though we're working in the Maremma. I don't know why I'm putting these images up, but and the kind of subsequent articulation of a holistic project of the Bonifica Integrale within the Italian territory, which moved beyond the sphere of land and water management to include the development of infrastructure and the redistribution of productive population to newly built rural settlements, mirroring and extending fascist colonial agendas. And so we begin to see internal patterns of migration and of colonization of Italian landscapes, following the motto and the very loud voice of Benito Mussolini, which looking for a new fatherland where fields will be completely reclaimed. And so this identification of practices of land reclamation with narrative of redemptions, of wild nature that needs to be redeemed from its impure condition, was a central aspect of the environmentalist discourse of fascism. And in the project of reclamation of these territories, of course, which are depicted as wastelands and malaria-infected plains, went hand in hand with the larger ideological project of redemption of the moral qualities of the entire nation. And so this swampy lands needed to be purified to conform to the sort of newly appreciated man order of nature. And so to support this reflection within the studio, we developed a new course with Irene Piano. We joined the curriculum. It's called The Rise and Fall of Rural Urbanism in Modern Italy, which delves into the history of schemes for land reclamation, land reform, and settler colonization from pre to post-unitary Italy. And then finally, in the last year, in the third year of the program, we'll confront the figure of the Italian islands with their contested history of multicultural heritage, internal colonialism, as well as contemporary migration. And so borrowing from the work of Sandil Hilal, Alessandro Petti, and Emilio Distretti from DAR, we start looking at the space of Sicily and its connection to the entity of colonization of Sicilian latifunda. But we'll think about the space of the island also as a device to think through the ideological possibility or impossibility of an island, to think through a broad study of pedagogies and their influence on the long tradition that they had in the Grand Tour in Italy. So this is architectural, the American Academy in Rome, the British School, but also our Syracuse student group, trying to find a way to engage with the complexity of a complex like Italy, with its conflicting and yet coexisting histories, an attempt to stop blindly reproducing the well-known narratives of the alleged primacy and superiority of Western civilization, as well as the self-perpetuating myth of the single white male Italian genius as the base of humanism. I want to conclude very briefly with the lecture series that we had in the last semester, year and a half. We were able to have a fantastic array of speakers from Mariana Pestana, the creator of the Istanbul Biennale Empathy, all the way to Why Architecture that I mentioned earlier on. This is just a very quick samples. This is from this semester. We have Heather Muriel. And I'm really, really happy to announce a collaboration that we just concluded with Griot Magazine to curate a series of events for the next 3 semesters together. Griot is a magazine and nomadic space that celebrates contemporary Italian creative culture as it relates to the African diaspora, and they're really a fantastic presence on the Italian territory. And finally, we have sort of just recently confirmed work with Hydro Maremma, which is sort of a local artist residency, if you like, in the space of the Maremma to possibly exhibit the work of our students there. And ongoing collaboration with Leica to continue to include new ways of surveying, digitally mapping and capturing sites that we will continue to see in relationship to the field studies of our class. So that's, thank you for maybe a couple of more minutes of my presentation.
Thank you. Can you hear me, Daniele? So, oh, Paula, you're
Yes.
there. Yay. Thank you for staying up so late. Sharp, oh my goodness. So what we're going to move to now is a series of 10-minute responses. So it's Paula, and then Mark. So I'll give you each a 2-minute warning. Paula, I don't know how to reach you, so 10 minutes.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. I need to, first of all, thank Dean Michael Speaks and Associate Dean Julia Czerniak for inviting me to participate in this event, and Daniele Profeta as the current director of the Florence program. I'm also very happy to join and reconnect with so many friends that I met when they were here in Florence, from Randall Corman to Larry Davis, Francisco Sanin, Lisa Campbell, Richard Rosa, Kyle Miller, David Shanks. Other than these friends and connections, I would like to briefly introduce myself because maybe most of you won't know me. I'm an architect. I studied at the Politecnico di Milano, and then I got my master's degree at SciArc. I was also a foreign exchange student when I was in high school. So I spent my junior and my senior year in California. And I think that this experience of living and studying and then also working abroad was for me truly life-changing. I'm saying this to students who are thinking of making a study abroad experience. And having this experience myself, I was really very happy when I had the opportunity to then teach in the programs that some American universities have in Florence. So I really like to guide these students as they make their adjustments to this new life in a new country. If possible, I would like to share my screen briefly. I have a few images that I collected to, can I do that? Yes?
Go for it, Paula.
Yeah, okay. Okay, you should be seeing my screen now. You do? Yes, Daniele, can you? Yes, okay, good. So I'm teaching at for two American programs here in Florence. I'm teaching at Cal Poly, San Luis Obispo and Pomona. The two schools have a program in Florence since the late 1960s. And the program was started by the late Cristiano Toralda di Francia, who was later joined a few years later by Gianni Pettena. And I also teach at Kent State University, that also has a program in Florence founded by Adolfo Natalini in the early 1970s. Cultural exchanges among these institutions, so among Syracuse University and Kent State University and Cal Poly, San Luis Obispo and Pomona, have been very strong in the course of the years. And actually my response to the presentations that happened so far would like to focus exactly on these collaborations and exchanges of experiences. I was happy to hear Randall in the very beginning mentioning how the role of Cristiano Toraldo di Francia was also instrumental in making the program for Syracuse University so much more, let's say, engaged and connected with the local community. That is one example of the very many collaborations that we have established and conducted in the course of years with programs. So I would say that really what was born was really a community among these US programs based in Florence, but there was also a growing involvement on the part of the city and other local institutions. So what I can mention, of course, is just a fraction of the many things that have happened in the course of a long history. Syracuse University architecture program has been in Florence for 40 years, and I've witnessed probably 15 or fewer years than those. But there have been very many events happening in the course of those years that I could participate. For example, a few years ago, when Francisco Sanin was directing the architecture program in Florence, there was an event called the Beyond Media Festival. It was a local event and an international event. I had a large participation of speakers from many countries and schools that exhibited work, and municipalities that presented their projects as well. And a roundtable discussion, for example, was conducted by Francisco Sanin, saw the participation of Peter Wilson, Felicity Scott, and Pier Vittorio Aureli. So in the audience, there were students from all of our universities, from Cal Poly, from Kent State, from Syracuse University. There was a beautiful exhibition that Francisco curated called Soulscape. It was dedicated to a series of talented architects from Seoul in Korea. And that exhibition was presented at Palazzo Vecchio in Florence. It traveled through European venues, and it was, of course, visited by all of our students. There have been events that have been produced or co-produced by our universities. I'm thinking of a symposium that was co-produced by Syracuse University and Cal Poly and Kent State University in Florence. It was titled Mixing Metabolisms, Old Cities and New Residents, and this was done together with the Professor Larry Davis. And it was about a discussion on the transformation of the built environment. or another event, Savage Architecture, that was curated by Davide Sacconi, and it saw the participation of Giampiero Frassinelli, one of the original founders of Super Studio, and 2A+P, which is a practice based in Rome. This symposium, there was a symposium, there was an exhibition. The students took part in all of these events and could engage in discussions with them. Richard Ingersoll was, of course, a very important figure in Florence, and a very talented and amazingly sensitive architectural historian. He offered a lot, and he gave a lot to Syracuse University, but he also gave a lot to our program at Cal Poly. We often invited him to talk to our students. There have been multiple exhibitions and events. This is just one of them. Kyle Miller was curating this exhibition when he was directing the school in Florence, where he was presenting works of some emerging architectural practices, and our students from Kent State and from Cal Poly had the opportunity to participate and attend this event. At Cal State, we also celebrated an important anniversary a few years ago, and that was an opportunity also for us to engage in conversations with faculty from other universities. Again, Kyle was in that year, he was still director of the school, so he was involved in the conversation with us. Midterm and final reviews are another moment when we, of course, exchange our experiences. It's not just the schools, though. I don't want that from these examples that you think that it's only a community created by the American universities, but there is a lot of engagement with local institutions and the university. First of all, the local University of Florence, but also the municipality. And this is something that we are eager to take advantage of. So we take advantage of these collaborations. It's a way for our students to broaden their experiences and to more deeply understand the city of Florence. They have the opportunity to engage in dialogues with students their age, who are also studying architecture at the Università di Firenze. And I think that probably Florence, also because of the size of the city, allows these exchanges and these collaborations even more closely than the city of Rome does. There's many other American universities that are based in Rome, but they're more living as more of a satellite, as independent satellites. In Florence, there is a lot more collaboration among the programs. I mean, at least that is my perception. As educators, so we try to do our best to have our students reach out to the local community and engage with the Florentines. The municipality has done its part. A few years ago, for example, the Councilor for Education created what she called Palazzo Giovane, which by a very funny circumstance is located in Via dei Vecchietti. And this is a joke that only Italian speakers can get. But it was a place to allow local and foreign students to meet and to have a place where they could engage in conversations. The library, La Biblioteca delle Oblate, is another place. It's an amazing institution that is really catering to the younger generations. There's many students who speak English and who speak Italian who attend Biblioteca delle Oblate. It's an amazing place, beautiful view of the cathedral, and a place where many events are organized. So within our academic program, I think that we are all questioning students about what role the students may have as temporary citizens in the city of Florence. It was actually very great for me to hear from Daniele Profeta the topics that he's exploring with his students in Florence. There are many overlaps with what we do at Cal Poly and at Kent State. Issues of racism and immigration in Italy, issues of historical identity in the Borghi. With students, I have often discussed the role of tourism which, you know, in cities like Florence, even more in cities like Venice, has been managed, unfortunately, by our city administrators very narrow-mindedly. So with students, we often speculate the role of citizenship through design briefs, through conversations, through project reviews. We challenge them to reflect on issues that the students themselves are experiencing firsthand. And this pandemic that has really dramatically transformed our cities proves that the model of tourist cities is something that we should be discussing and critiquing. And I think that that's the topic that we will keep discussing in the many years to come. Thank you.
Grazie Paola.
Grazie Daniele.
Go like that. Cool. Okay, so thank you to Michael and to Julia, as well as to Daniele for inviting me to participate in this. I'm going to do something a little counterintuitive, which is that I'm going to talk about a completely different school, but as a means of giving some additional context to what was happening in Florence and what was happening with the Syracuse program, to suggest some alignments and misalignments with Syracuse's curriculum and parallel concerns in architectural education. Now, Italy has long been a destination for study, from the grand tours of European noblemen from the 17th to 19th centuries to post-war scholar exchanges funded by the Fulbright and Rockefeller Brothers Foundations as a means of promoting a liberal democratic world order rooted in knowledge. Italy's architectural patrimony and menagerie of monuments has served as a fulcrum for the students' encounter with history and civilization. Studying abroad is a rite of passage, but today in the context of the International Research University, it's also about learning how to be a global citizen. To study abroad means entering a foreign context alongside students from around the world, each of whom arrives with their own perspectives and national backgrounds, all of whom now have to work together to navigate a new cultural terrain. And at the very moment that Syracuse launched its program in Florence, another architectural institute was taking shape 3 hours to the east. Like Syracuse students, they enmeshed themselves in Italian architecture, urbanism, and daily life, but with a very different agenda. Opening in 1976, the International Laboratory of Architecture and Urban Design, known as ILAUD, was the vision of the Milanese architect Giancarlo De Carlo. ILAUD took up the study of global problems at a local scale, learning from the existing environment and from citizens destined to occupy an architectural or urban design. Rejecting the institutional authority of the school as well as the one-off nature of the summer course, ILAUD was designed as a laboratory where, quote, continuous research is performed, led by architects and non-architects from different countries who meet, compare their ideas and their work, explore theoretical themes, and draw up projects based on common interests, unquote. De Carlo and the faculty viewed their approach to teaching as a pedagogy of resistance. Architectural education in a pluralistic world required a third way beyond autonomous negative utopias or postmodern complicity with the market's alienating hunger for nostalgic pabulum. Their agonistic approach to learning wagered on experimenting with conflictual design methods developed through international debate and collective research. So each year, faculty and students from schools around the world came to the isolated, fog-bound town of Urbino. And taking Urbino as a case study, or in later years, Siena, Venice, and San Marino, the students analyzed local urban and architectural problems and then speculated on solutions. During their residency, they attended lectures on architectural history and contemporary topics, including science, technology, politics, economics, and ecology. Students then returned to their home countries, America, Argentina, Belgium, Brazil, Canada, Chile, Croatia, France, India, Italy, the Netherlands, Norway, Scotland, South Africa, Spain, Sweden, and Switzerland, just to name a few, and reconsidered each year's theme by investigating local manifestations of the very same issues which ILAUD then collected and published. The diversity of ELAUD's participants characterized what DiCarlo called its heteronomy. Cultural and political differences among the students presented problems and opportunities for the laboratory, generating irreconcilable battles as well as unexpected design proposals. On the other hand, among the recurring faculty and visiting lecturers, including Dennis Lasden, Donald Linden, John McKean, Christian Norberg Schultz, Renzo Piano, and Allison and Peter Smithson, there were common interests: place and memory, politics and community engagement, and the language of architectural and urban form as civic discourse. Their research efforts tackled an array of built expressions and lived experiences of architecture, including typology, the street, public space, the town as an architectural nucleus, adaptive reuse, the vernacular, and landscape. But it was the pedagogical focus of conflict that set ELAUD apart from other educational environments. The curriculum was formed as a response to century-old challenges confronting architecture and society at the millennium's close: industrialization, consumerism, wealth inequity, radical technological change, the destruction of the environment, and a host of social conflicts, especially demands by minorities and the oppressed for civil rights and social justice. The promises of the Enlightenment concept of progress had failed to extend modernity's benefits to all citizenry, which exacerbated feelings of cultural dislocation, alienation, and rootlessness amidst the loss of personal liberties through manipulations by bureaucratic and state machineries. This is the statement for founding a school. The committee further argued that whereas the architects of the modern movement had overturned the aesthetic, material, and technological backwardness of the 19th century, they never repudiated that century's sociocultural values. Modernism simply transformed architecture into a neutral discipline that, through, quote, a unified language insensitive to cultural inheritance and regional differences, aimed at providing total solutions for a universal society, but only ended up producing a model of harmony that served the privileged, preserved social and economic inequity, and reinforced human behaviors that inhibit self-realization and fundamental social change. Now, of course, Team 10 and Giancarlo DiCarlo had been reconsidering modernism for 3 decades. However, ELAUD's faculty found very few answers in late 20th century education, which tended toward formalism, rationalism, and technocracy. At a moment when the dominant pedagogical methods reinforce the narcissistic production of objects that satiate architects' egos and encourage the formulation of hermetic career-making projects, ELAUD sought a humbler, bottom-up, anti-heroic learning. Its pedagogy revolved around methods of participation. Rather than a method embraced for its socio-political bona fides, they considered participation to be in a state of crisis. Participation as idea and practice had morphed into techniques of power sharing and co-management exploited by bureaucracies, corporations, and the powerful as a deterrent to all kinds of conflict. That's another quote. Equally problematic were forms of participation that only increased an architect's understanding of a population, which, quote, usually ends in the architect patronizing the citizens by using research as leverage, unquote. ELAUD reconsidered participation along 2 lines: talking and reading. Talking took the form of debate in the studios. Dialogues across nationalities cut across sections through design techniques, pedagogies, cultural values, aesthetic preferences, and even politics. Talking and arguing as a means of learning how to negotiate conflict were crucial for marginalizing doctrinarism and for emphasizing differences over similarities. Reading was defined as the critical interpretation of the physical environment from the peculiarity of physical fabrics and their use. Reading as communicative drawing and analysis had a practical orientation, getting around the language difficulties that students would face when speaking with the Italian public and one another. But it also had a political and cognitive outlet. For learning to read architectural signs, which they defined as physical manifestations of architecture, as well as how people behave in public space, was just another way of developing design abilities as a form of communication skills. Recognizing, and this is a quote from DiCarlo, that there is no behavior that lacks conflict. This required students to reconsider matters of form and language beyond the simple act of addressing the basic need for shelter. Similarly, reading gave a political orientation to the theme of reuse, a recurring concern that asked students to study and intervene in dense urban fabrics and to adapt existing architectures to new purposes. Indeed, rather than the recycling of existing structures, reuse involved, quote, the reconsideration of discarded values, recovery of abandoned technologies, and the readoption of signs and messages that don't meet institutional codes, which is to say the codes of contemporary systems of power. Taken together, participation and reuse underlined ELAUD's pedagogy of resistance to an architect as a specialist form giver. Quoting DiCarlo, architects deal with problems, but not always just to solve them. Sometimes architects have to raise problems, unquote. Lastly, reading as a design skill was a means of looking to context to evolve what they called, quote, a multiplicity of architectural languages. DeCarlo defined the term as a healthy diversity of expressions that are at once legible, specific, rooted in time and place, and result from popular decision-making amidst a culture of irreconcilable conflict rather than the disease of anachronistic citations of what they called architecture's new eclecticism, their term for what they soon would call postmodernism. Much like Syracuse's Florence students who learned to read architectural and urban form, ELAUD rooted its investigations in historical places layered with memory and meaning. However, they viewed these places as resilient to and threatened by global capitalism. DeCarlo, an anarchist committed to social justice and to architecture as a political project, saw architecture as a process of changing the present and the future, which demanded reconsidering the profession's obligations to fighting inequity. Indeed, I think that rather than being offended at how Modena's Antifa have graffitied the building where ELAUD's archive is kept, he would see it as an expression of political urgencies and community aspirations that were the very aim of ELAUD's ethical pedagogy, a pedagogy arising from a constant questioning that is social, political, technical, aesthetic, and self-critical, taking the future consequences of architecture as its most important concern. So, for the students currently in Florence, and for those of you that will soon be making the trip, I don't mean to suggest from all of this that just because our world is in a state of crisis, that you should not immerse yourself in history and culture when you're in Italy. You should savor the decadence of a bistecca alla fiorentina and the sublimity of a Bellini, or a day after hanging out under the Tuscan sun, lidaring with Professor Profeta, have a Negroni, which will get you much more quickly on the path to recuperating. However, studying in Italy is as much about looking forward as it is about looking backward, an idea about history and the future expressed by the Roman god Janus. More importantly, it's your community with all of your different backgrounds, politics, and interests that will make your experience in Florence meaningful. You'll learn as much from one another as you will from Italy. It's your international diversity, your spirit of collegiality, and your shared commitment to the most pressing issues of today that makes today's Syracuse students very much like ELAUD's students of 40 years ago, who forged the way to a different collaborative international approach to addressing the global problems of the built and natural environment. Thank you.
Last but not least, Professor Randall.
Working? Yep, good.
Okay. Whoa, that's loud. Well, thank you for inviting me to a whole world that I'm really only very loosely connected to. And probably the remarks will show that, but maybe some distance from the site in Daniele's words will help. I composed this response as two hypotheses, or maybe they're synopses about the Florence program, what we heard today, but more importantly about why after 40 years we should continue to have a program in Florence, or more generally continue to study abroad, although that phrase may not be the best one. I wanted to see if those hypotheses might be supported by the talks today. Julia began the event with an extremely important and too easily avoided point that the Florence program was founded at the chronological epicenter of postmodernism, 1980. And I would add that the founding fathers of the Florence program were among the true believers in a particular variation of postmodernism, which Randall and Ted ably conveyed in their talks. It's also important to note that at that moment, architectural design and theory had the full attention of other fields. Architecture was at the head of the postmodern pack, or at least riding the wave in real time. So how do we think forward from or out of the ways the program's identity, pedagogies, and purposes for most of the last 40 years have been defined by a postmodern attitude towards the past? I'd like to say that postmodernism is the answer to the question, why Florence? Britt's talk opened up some imagination about broader context of the program's past, the why Florence. And when he and I were discussing how to approach these responses, he said that by 1980, we're talking about postmodernism, by 1980, Italy had already been postmodern for at least 300 years. But it would seem that the rest of the world had caught up by 1980, a moment when it was either very uncool or very awkward or maybe even absurd to talk about the future. It was the moment of the presence of the past, or maybe the present of the post. If modernism might be defined as a historical condition where the burden of the past becomes so great that our imaginations flee into the future, 1980, the moment of the postmodern condition, might be defined as one where the burden of the future was so great that we, and I include myself, whether contrarian or reactionary or subversive, were fleeing into the past. That's perhaps the most pithy way I can explain why a bunch of folks in Syracuse decided they needed to set up an American outpost in Florence. So this first hypothesis is that the program has been evolving over the past 10 to 15 years in ways that are reckoning with a world that Britt described very well, and others, in which even Italy is no longer postmodern. The 300-year run is over. In our globalized world of hyperbolic, fungible smoothness and artifice, which is constantly testing the possibility of neo-modern or post-historical thinking, even going to Italy no longer allows ironic or guilt-laden or anxious returns to history. We're all neo-moderns now, who have an ironic, guilty, anxious, or earnest relationship to the present. Everything collapses into nowness. Nothing's old. And everything is new in a world that is constantly refreshing, repeating, recycling, recollecting, recording, and upgrading. Ours is a time of speculative intensification and self-conscious deployment of new versions of known strategies, a sense that simultaneously our condition is on the one hand radically different than any known past because it requires this kind of incessant novelty, which has become trivial, easy, and cheap, or on the other hand, where something called real newness has become impossible, and where newness is no longer a strategic intervention in the future, or even an inventive recuperation of the past, but simply a tactical intervention in this ever present. The past and the future are all now. So in that situation, the question becomes not why Florence, but why not Florence? Could be anywhere. The second hypothesis, which as I found out a few minutes ago, several minutes ago, it's on a collision course with Richard, is that we are shifting from something we could call study abroad, as I mentioned earlier, to what should probably be called global study. And that digital media, from Zoom to photogrammetry to ubiquitous imaging to established digital design and fabrication tools, and what digital media enables and what it makes seemingly obsolete is crucial to the why not. Why not go to Florence? Why not use Florence as a charged global site in both typical and particular ways to engage in global architectural education, projects, experiences, and research that are necessary in this moment of incessant presentness? And to propose or to endorse maybe even Daniele's plans for pedagogy and research and the ways they align with the hypothesis I'm trying to offer. You know, whether he's talking about the Borgo Digitale or the Bonafice and the fascist ideology that's reconfigured the cultural landscape of the 20th century, the Isole as sites of internal colonialism and contemporary migration and so on. But he didn't get to talk about, and I think he has some ideas, and many people did talk today about where should we go? And I mean that quite, not literally, quite virtually. Where should we go with the survey class? I think this is really a crucial thing to be thinking about, and I know Daniele's thinking about it. that there need to be changes in not only what will be surveyed, but more important in how it will be surveyed. And to raise the question of why or whether or how much, or simply just how you need to go there to do this work or implement this pedagogy and research, which is urgent and necessary almost everywhere now. So why not Florence? And if not there, where? And just to wrap up, I want to mention in the manner of Britt's alternative parallel histories, what might seem like an idiosyncratic example of what I'm talking about right now, that comes from the early 90s, that I think Ted made pretty clear was a key transitional moment historically, but also in the way the Florence program has been evolving for the last 20, 25 years in fits and starts and in all sorts of multiple directions. This event from the early 90s, that's a transitional event like the ones Ted talked about, that speculated on the future of Leon Battista Alberti. So the year was 1994, a year that for many of us is exemplified by Koolhaas's MoMA show, the Bigness show, a key moment in a shifting, an exemplary moment in a shifting reality of architectural practice and production, the end of criticality, the launch of the projective, and many other ways to explain it. But over in Italy, there was a lesser known architectural blockbuster. The images on the left, the black and white ones, are of some of the work in that show at the Palazzo del Te in Mantova, curated by Alberti scholars Joseph Rickwert and Robert Tavenor, you know, not exactly radicals, founders of the Alberti group based in Edinburgh. It was a huge scholarly endeavor, but for us, the key component was several computer models of Alberti's designs that were based on photogrammetry of his buildings. So models of his designs based on photogrammetry of his buildings that were translated into AutoCAD running on PC 4086 machines supplied by Olivetti and generated with now forgotten software called AutoSolid and wavefront animation running on Unix-based Silicon graphics machines. I like to think that the models were a way, Rickwert's way to take Alberti back to the future. But simultaneously, they were a postmodern effort by Tavenor in line with some Italian scholars and architects and archaeologists, and the work on the right, which is from 10 years later, is an example of where that leads, who were doing work with photogrammetry and computer modeling to document and conserve endangered monuments in the country with the hope that computers could save and democratize the future of the past. Meanwhile, I'll give the last words to Herbert Mouchamp, who in a New York Times review of the show wrote that, quote, the sophisticated, you know, it's 1994, but you listen to the writing and, you know, it could almost be today. The sophisticated technology is dazzling as we watch Alberti's domes, architraves, and piazzas, which Tavenor's team had digitally corrected and perfected to be closer to the design, you know, supposed design intent, whirl weightlessly through cyberspace. We get an uncanny sense of connection between Alberti's time and our own. Suddenly, the Renaissance seems poised on the threshold of the internet. That's it.
So, I'm going to invite the presenters on the stage, and I just have a few questions too, and then we'll open it up.
Yes, I'm here, but please use the mic, otherwise I cannot hear anything.
We'd like to see your faces for the I want to thank you all for a content-rich afternoon. And I think it will take a little while to unpack. I found there were many threads that went through the decades, and there were some radical shifts and positions, which I think are super interesting to think about as we move forward. But first, I want to acknowledge that Larry Davis, Kyle Miller, David Shanks, Richard, and are joining us. And they each at various times directors at the Florence program. And and Francisco, of course. Hi, Francisco. Are you there? Hi. You're muted. Okay. So anyway, what I would like to do to begin is just to have those of you who weren't able to present yet, you were in the director position, to we already had our reflections, but I didn't know if you would like to reinforce how some of the issues of your decade were presented, or contradict it, or add to the conversation about next steps. And then what I would like to do is see if you have questions for each other. I think there were some really interesting moments, especially when we went, I think, from Richard's presentation to Daniele's about the program. And then we'd like to hear from questions from the audience. But Kyle, why don't you start?
I have to begin by refuting my colleague Richard Rosa's claims about Hitchcock becoming Marvel and what was the other one? Beethoven becoming Bieber. I think we've done better. I think we have people like Barry Jenkins and Johnny Greenwood. And I think one of the things that I attempted to do when coming off of Richard's tenure was, you can correct me if this is a mischaracterization, but seek out a new cast of protagonists in the Italian and even European landscape to latch onto, to reinvigorate the program and seek new territory for conceptual investigations, rather than, this is the part you might want to refute, lament the loss of some of the authority of previous disciplinary figures. And I think that was a challenge. And I think now I see how Daniele is dealing with that. And Daniele and I talked about this as well. I think what he's doing, and this is something Erica Wilkins mentioned at the beginning, like one thing that global programs do for students is it takes them out of their comfort zone. And I've seen a couple of moments today where we've taken our program out of its comfort zone. I think Liz and Larry did that when they introduced the workshops and ventured into new towns. And I found that quite inspiring, and it inspired some of the work that I did when I was there. And I think what Daniele is doing now is incredibly fantastic in seeking out new territory, engaging with issues that are more global and they transcend the local, but apply them within the local contexts and cultures. And Daniele knows that I'm very jealous of what he's done and how he's able to approach his tenure as director. And I think it's a very bright future for the program if it continues to push itself out of its comfort zone and into new territory that it's not ventured into previously.
Thank you. And Richard, would you like to make a, would you like to respond?
That sounds great.
Oh, okay. You know, it's one thing that's interesting that I think was really clear when Daniele presented, though, was that the acceleration of change was certainly exacerbated by the current cultural crises of our world and health crises of our world, whether it's Black Lives Matter or whether it's the pandemic and the need to, you know, would we not visit these sites? For instance, you know, so it's very interesting to me about how that has been accelerated. But David.
It was great to kind of hear the arc of the program from its inception through, you know, some maybe an arc is the right representation, some kind of curlicues, maybe in tangents and different things, to now, you know, where it's headed in the future. I think it's really terrific. One thing that struck me was something that Mark briefly mentioned about whether study abroad really is the right kind of term for what's happening. And I would be interested to hear, we probably don't have time to do it now, but maybe going forward, from the previous faculty in the Florence program, you know, what the kind of changing motivations for having study abroad programs, you know, have been. Our student body has changed quite a lot since 1980. And for many of our students, the home campus is a study abroad campus already. I mean, we have something like 40% international students. So maybe the presumption that students are in their comfort zone currently and exit that comfort zone when they go to the abroad sites, maybe that's slightly anachronistic to some degree, in that many of our students are already outside of their comfort zones if we presume the kind of concomitants of home. I would guess that in 1980, the majority of our students in Syracuse architecture came from nearby and came from maybe similar backgrounds, or there was some presumption of commonality. That has changed quite a lot. And maybe the home campus, thinking of itself as a kind of study abroad site already, you know, can kind of learn from some of these conversations.
That's a really good point, David. Thank you for that. True, right? And earlier on, I kind of made the mistake that Syracuse is a choice for, but it actually is, right? In terms of being away. Actually, Larry.
That was a good introduction to what I was going to say. First, before that, I want to just say, you know, something about the time that I was there, and Liz, I think, really portrayed the spirit of it very, very well. I mean, just getting engaged in the community, the professional community there, and understanding how that could be different depending on where you are. At that time, we still had mostly Americans there, but I think that understanding that if you conceive of what the profession's role is in a larger society, you might have a more effective model. And so hopefully our goal was to try and have the students take that back with them, and that they had to roll up their sleeves and get involved in the messy politics, to get uncomfortable, and really sometimes expect the unexpected. We had some kind of stressful moments between the students and the and maybe other students from another country, or maybe some of the local people that they were working with in one of the workshops. But I think those were really important moments too. And they weren't always happy, I have to say, the students were with us. But I think that hopefully this will be something I can carry forward. To speak to what you were talking about, David, I think that's a really good point. The future of Florence, you know, I think is a really interesting thing. I think Daniele is starting to expand it in a kind of global way, perhaps. It's interesting, I think your model, Britt, of bringing the whole world to one place and having a debate, I think is a really good model. I think this question of our students being from all over the world now coming there, I think the question I want to ask them is, what do they think Florence means to them? And what could it mean? There's this cross-cultural model of teaching now, which I think is really important. But and Ingersoll, Richard Ingersoll, the late historian who taught there, just amazing, a writer and thinker, I think. In his cross-cultural global history, I think really sets a model for looking at themes that weave in and out of different cultures and how those have a kind of impact, have a gravitas, how you could begin to manipulate them, but then also particularize them based on different situations. So, working with people, I think, from other parts of the world in Florence might be another way to go forward too. So there's other things I can say, but I think other people need to
Thanks,
speak too.
Larry. And then Francisco, you were a director for a while at Florence. We saw you in many photos today. Would you like to share some thoughts?
Sure. Yeah, I was thinking in total about 7 years in Florence. I'm now 20 minutes away from Florence, so staying late. Now, I mean, just a couple of quick thoughts. One, this event today is really, it's been amazing. And I don't think it's only something to be watched or to be reviewed. I think it's going to be, its content is something that needs to be studied, unpacked, and I think debated. There's some fantastic insights, fairly rigorous analysis of evolution of positions from the very origins of what Daniele would call the the claim to Western superiority or uniqueness or authority, to in a way going back to Italy, considering the seeds of its own critiques. It's a sort of interesting arc of going to Italy to learn the masters and then find that Italy in itself contains the very seeds of its own contradictions that can be unpacked. One thing that's always been a question for me is the kind of the feedback loop between Italy, what happens in Italy stays in Italy, instead of how we can work its way through. And it seems just as a sort of a hypothetical proposition, what would happen if you take Daniele's proposition of looking at Italy's internal contradiction of migration, colonization, fascism, struggles with migration, identity, and exclusion and inclusion, and applied to the US itself. And I wonder, how could these methodologies travel across the sea and engage in a truly global, let's say, discourse? And for my part, as a director, my intention was really to open up the program to an international dialogue at a moment where the global discourse on architecture was opening up to issues like politics and others. So yeah, that was part of an intention of I guess what Mark was saying. Why not Florence? In a way, Florence had this ability to be a place that had a certain appeal and could be a sort of anchoring point, a satellite to engage with global dialogue. And I think some of the presentations reflected on that. But a fantastic event, really amazing discussion. I think worth
Glad
looking
we
at.
join us. I'm sorry about the miscommunication. So thank you for sticking with us and joining us this evening.
Julia, can I read the question from the chat? That
so I don't see a question.
Okay, I would love to throw this question in the mix, and I also would like not to respond to this question because it feels like I am defending myself. So please, someone else take this. But it's a really good question by Eli, which is a current student here in Florence, which thanks us everybody for the beautiful presentations and says, "I'm delighted that we can consider and critique the decadence of architecture in Italy. But I wonder why our architecture's commitment has transformed from the formal to the ecological. Why are we visiting lagoons and lakes instead of the architecture of the past? For example, Terrani, Corbusier, San Michele, and Piranesi. Randall invited us architects to consider the history. Still, in the current pedagogy, we have yet to come to see Como or Milan during our stay in Florence, and it's not within our current schedule. Why is this integral part of the architectural canon of Italy being dismissed and excluded from our education of architecture? I mean, I obviously can answer this question, but I don't think I should defend myself. So I think it would be nice to use it as a starter of a conversation, because I'm sure Richard would want to jump on this.
Ted.
I don't have a response, but I just thought I would just take the question so I can get my mask off. I think that it's a great question. I think, and it opens up for me maybe two responses. One is a methodological. So how might you study? And what are the tools that you can use to study? Certainly when I was in Florence, our tools, pencils, our measuring sticks were typically our bodies. And it seems to me that we haven't lost the pencil, but if we have other tools that allows us to investigate and analyze and project in other ways, I think that's fantastic. Whether that's an Albertian church in Mantova or the Pontine Marsh. I think the other, which really opens up, or maybe there's three parts of the response. One is, broadly the question, to what degree is the program stable, and that people always visit the same sites independent of methodology? To what degree is the program engaged in new sets of issues, new kinds of problems that are indeed global problems? I don't think, hopefully it's, for me, it's not an either or, it's a both and. So why not have a 2-semester program? We used to. But I think that I don't think we should, in my opinion, simply fix what we see and what ways in which we try to look at, describe, analyze, and use that information, if you will, or use those results projectively. I don't think that should be fixed. And it really hasn't been. I mean, it's been moderately fixed at times, but I don't think, and I think it's, and this is very different, obviously, than what we were doing with what Daniele is doing. But when we were going to the new towns and down into Latina and Sabaudia, the Pontine Marsh, same area that Daniele has recently studied, that was like off the radar. Or the same kinds of questions. Why do we have to go to Ferrara for 3 times in 1 semester? Which just allows opportunities and flexibility within a program, and obviously within Italy, which has enormous opportunities.
Maybe just a very brief response, just to maybe question some of the terminology in the question. I don't think it's an act of exclusion, because certainly the student's able to name those individuals, which presumes they know something about them. I think it's about capitalizing on what's most salient today in that context, and perhaps there are issues that demand attention and then come at the expense of certain excursions. But there's other ways to learn about those figures that transcend the field experience. But I would say that it's what Daniele is bringing to the program is supplemental or complementary or an extension of those historical narratives that are certainly introduced to the students in the classroom prior to their visit to Italy. I would challenge that it's an exclusion. I think it's a matter of priority.
Yeah, I'm not going to answer the question. I'm just going to ask it in a different way. And it gets at, I think, some of the interesting questions that Mark also raised about why Italy. But I would also add to that one, what is meaningful about being in a place, any place, rather than studying it digitally. You can do here. You don't need to anywhere else. That's all I'm gonna, I mean, I have a lot of other things to say. Leave that one up to Rand.
Well, frankly, I don't know what to say. I'm the dinosaur here. I mean, I was there for the Precambrian period, you know, when we got started, and a lot of my, you know, sort of focus has to do with that period back. Certainly, I went back to Florence to teach on a number of occasions, most recently 2001 to 2003. As far as the question is concerned, I'm very sympathetic to what that person is addressing there, because for me, there was no substitute for direct experience. You know, there is something palpable, there's something physical, sensual, emotional, you know, about walking into a space, you know, like the or the Pantheon, what I would refer to as the aha moment that students have. And as a faculty member who had been to those places many, many times, seeing it through the eyes of the student, you know, was always an incredible kind of thing. I'm conflicted because my own sensibilities and my heart lies with that hands-on instruction that addresses questions of history and how one reconciles that with modernity. And I think what we did during the 80s, and certainly the vector for that was the faculty, and that so many of them had made it to Cornell, they had drunk the Cornell Kool-Aid. It was a fortuitous opportunity to launch the program because you knew that there was going to be that sort of pedagogical continuity that was provided by the faculty. At the end of the 80s, the beginning of the 90s, that began to change, and people were coming from other schools began to be teaching over there. And I think that was a good thing, because I think what happened in the 80s was good and necessary, but it was not something that needed to continue on forever. We didn't need to swim in the postmodern period forever. Where we go from here, I think, is a very large question. But the forces of the contemporary world that are now pressing in on us, like ecological and climate crisis, of terrorism, of nuclear armament, and so on, tends to displace those earlier concerns that we had about history, about context, about a pedagogy that's rooted in building and making. So I don't know, I mean, I don't know where this is all going. I'm happy that Daniele is there. He's the first Italian native director that we've ever had. And while in the past, I've always had some concerns about that, about the day in which an Italian would take over the program versus somebody who was trained back here in the United States, for a lot of reasons that I won't go into. The fact that Daniele has spent time teaching in the trenches here at Syracuse, I think is important. And so him being over there now represents, I think, a unique opportunity that we have. And so my hope is that he is given the support by the school, by the administration, other faculty, to do what I think it needs to be done to make the transition into this new world that the program is going into. So, Daniele, buona fortuna. And bocca al lupo.
Grazie, Randall. Maybe I'll, if it's possible, I'll chime in really quickly on this.
Like to say something?
Yes, very briefly, I promise. Because I mean, first of all, I'm really happy to be able to have this conversation with all of you and also with the students, which I've come to realize that the kind of expectations of the students' experience of the abroad study, it's perhaps one of the one of the biggest elements to work with in terms of like how to argue for a specific reading of this, what Erica mentioned in the beginning of this sort of like uncomfortable positioning of the students abroad. And so the kind of comfortable image that it's that comes with from the beginning is perhaps also one of the things that I'm most excited to work with, against, and through, in a sense. But to me, you know, I want to make sure and clarify that, like, in no way in my, let's say, pedagogical ambition here in this very short 1.5 year left, in no way there is a desire to remove an attention to an historical context here in Italy. In no way at all. In fact, I was shocked when I saw Randall's study abroad survey class schedule, which is almost to the letter the same of the one that we're having, except many very minor interventions, so like 1 or 2 trips sort of slightly moved in terms of location or destination. Rather, my hope is to try to create a little bit more of a dynamic relationship between some of the stories that can be told about those same historical artifacts. So perhaps a slightly different story, a slightly different kind of way of connecting a broader public or a broader kind of investigation that, yes, perhaps sometimes exceeds the only formal reading of those sites, but is always through sort of an extreme of value that is attributed to those devices for developing an architectural conversation of what do we do as designers today. And I think it's a very interesting question that, I mean, I'm sorry that I completely agree with Mark, didn't really come through in my presentation. And in the end, I was telling Julie as well, I feel like I tried to pack too many things and I didn't quite maybe clarify this sort of focus on the field study class as one that really makes this question about, like, what do we look at as architect today? Like, when we are in the field, what is the object of our observation? And again, far from me to say that, like, the way that we have walked through Florence, for example, in the last 2 weekends, sort of disregards the primary, the Cardo and the Dedicumano that Randall talked about, or the relationship between San Marco and San Miniato, all elements that we touched in very similar manner. The hope is only once we're there, once we are looking at this kind of infrastructure, that we look at it with perhaps like slightly different eyes that we have done in the past, in ways that we are able to connect it to a wider discourse of what architecture is today. How does it help us sort of connect to a larger sort of cultural discourse beyond the individual object? That's my hope. And again, just to clarify to the students that are connected and to all of you, like, far from wanting to remove the historical balance of Florence, because in fact, responding to Marx, I mean, I think, you know, I was reading some super interesting piece on the American Academy around the 2000s that were asking the same questions. Why are we in Rome? If this is a global education and it can happen anywhere, why are we in Rome? And for me, it does matter that it's in Florence. I mean, it does matter that it's in Italy as a place that's so vehemently sort of constructed, sort of the backdrop of that canon, of that architectural canon. And so to be able to do kind of this shift here, to be able to sort of include a conversation that uses those same artifacts to create a slightly different conversation, I think is a huge opportunity to then, like Francisco said, bring back the same kind of logic elsewhere, across the ocean, back in the US, in the Syracuse curriculum, as well as in other schools.
Thank you. You know, I want to offer the opportunity to members of the audience to ask some questions, but also Eli, I want to thank you for your question. It was very precise and it cut right to what's at stake in many ways. So thank you for that. But I know our advisory board members are going to move on soon. So I don't know if you have a question you'd like to ask the panel or just comments you'd like to share. Jeff, you never have nothing to say. You want to say something? Okay. By the time I get you. Dean speaks. Okay. Anyone else actually? Sorry, I didn't give you the microphone. Any other questions or comments or from those on Zoom? What about the panel to each other?
I believe Bob Chairman is trying to ask a question.
Okay.
I think you need to unmute him.
Okay.
Yeah, we can hear you.
I was one of Randall's baby dinosaurs in 1980 with Liz Kamel, and I had a degree in engineering before I came to Syracuse, and it was like pulling aside a curtain. The world changed from black and white to color, music, culture, food, sensation of the sun, Villa Gambaria. You could smell the plants, the fig trees, the olive trees. It was a whole nother world, but it was expression of passion, romance, progression, drama, and those ideas like Francisco was questioning, why not bring that back? And that's what I try to bring back to the United States. And the idea of progression at villas and what happens in each location. Stefano Ferra talked about that in Genova. As you climb the elevation, things changed, business, politics, romance. Those kind of issues were important to me, and the architecture, touching it, feeling it, even smelling it. Some of the buildings, there's a whole effect. And in engineering, I could do that in my studio. I don't need to be anywhere. But in Italy, I had such a hunger to travel, to see so many sites with Randall, Kevin Sloan, Giorgio Ciucci giving us the tours of Rome, his academy, base places that were inaccessible, attics, all kinds of things that you wouldn't get in the studio or in a textbook. And I highly recommend hands-on sketching at the site, maybe not as complex as we did. We spent hours standing there drawing sometimes, but you have to do some of that. But seeing as much as possible really made the effect for me. So I appreciate everything Randall did and continues to do. I did my master's with Randall as well, 20 years later, 2002 and 3. So it improved. The whole program changed from a little apartment across in Ultra Arno, where our power went out for days. We lost water for days, 17 people on one toilet. It was a different world back then in 1980. And things changed quite drastically and for the good. But can I say one more thing? Andrea Ponzi, he expressed passion. He lit up when we designed and we did not respect the architecture, the historic. He told me the materials I was using were sacred. I should not use in a secular situation. I learned so many things from him. He had passion for Italian architecture and history. And I appreciate what I learned. Thank you.
No, I mean, we're getting up close to 6 o'clock, but we are clearly just beginning a conversation. And I thank all of you for contributing content to enable us to have it. It certainly is something I look forward to continuing, but I don't know if you do have any final questions or comments for each other, or should we just wrap it up?
It's not I don't think it's a contentious or a debate instigating idea, but as a student at that time, as a student when Seligman sort of initiated the program, and a student of those teachers that were brought in then in Florence and then back here and then teaching here again. One thing I would say, and Mark, you said that we're in a collision course. I'm not on a collision course, but one thing that I think is worth clarifying, and I appreciate a lot of the historical and theoretical commentary about the relationship to and role of postmodernism at that time. But this is probably not a very well-known thing or understood thing, but we went there not to learn postmodernism. It was sort of rejected in our education. We went there to learn modernism. Being there was a way for us to understand fundamentally, to make the link, well, this was not stated this way, but to make the link between Le Corbusier and that work. In other words, we couldn't understand all of the translations and transformations of Le Corbusier's houses and villas and some of his larger projects without studying the antecedents to those through the Renaissance mostly, and then obviously the Greek work and the temples and all that. But the Renaissance wasn't about, as I said in my presentation, a nostalgic or romantic kind of how do we make this and then operate in some postmodern way, which doesn't mean we didn't have some angles on roofs occasionally, but it was about modernism, and it was about getting at the core of understanding that work in a much more abstract and insightful way. That's the way I understood it, even when I was there. Great.
I mean, all I would say is precisely the way you described modernism is what I meant by postmodernism. The fact that the access to the past is through a certain analysis of form to some past of several hundred years earlier constrains and in beautiful ways produces amazing results, amazing kinds of practices. But, I think they're both, I'll say, powerless to address these other kinds of issues. That the kinds of issues like ecological degradation or global migration, or I don't think they're extradisciplinary anymore is the point.
Microphone.
I don't last word, but I discuss these things a lot with my students as well, and we run through all of those issues that we care about as human beings and responsible citizens are impacted by medical profession, agriculture, architecture, airline, transportation, et cetera. Like, there is not a discipline that does not have a carbon footprint impact or an ecological or environmental concern. The fact that our things that we make, some of us, touch the ground and impact it in more obviously literal ways doesn't necessarily make architecture more responsible than medical professions' impact on the environment. And you can just think about the myriad of reverberant kind of ways in which that takes place. So I don't know that all of these citizenship and health of the planet issues are more related to or the responsibility of architecture. I think they should. I guess my point of my presentation is what I tell my students is I don't teach you how to be a human being. All of this stuff we have to do if we're going to be a respectable, responsible person. What we can do here is other things that develop some disciplinary expertise so that when we have the opportunity to make decisions about these things, we have expertise rather than what I would, I don't know what word I would use, sort of a tangential comprehension of the depth of architecture. So I know that architecture is related to engineering and it's related to the environment, and we're fond of taking advantage of and taking a great deal of responsibility in those areas. I just don't want to replace I want to call it historical knowledge, the disciplinary knowledge, with the commitment and the responsibility to the world, the environment, and other political crises that we mentioned today. It's not an either or. Either. That's the one. I feel like it's becoming an either or. I feel like it's becoming an either or.
Just briefly, I think it's a baby and bathwater issue. The program is going to change. There's no question about that. It's going to evolve into something else, as it should. The question is, what do we leave behind and what do we take forward with us? So Daniele, I would ask you, please don't give up sketching. Make sure that they sketch all the time. So.
All right, go, Liz.
Yeah, I just want to say one thing. I mean, we're here to talk about Florence, but I see it as a constellation in relation to the school. It gets back also to David's point about the fact that in some ways we are a foreign program here to many students. And if we think about what Florence represents and what it does in relation to the other programs that we have, and now, Faye is in Shanghai, there is, I think it's a much broader kind of constellation of possibilities that need to be understood and discussed, not in relation to themselves, but also as part of a much larger curricular agenda. And maybe this is a good way to start talking about what that curricular agenda is, both here and abroad, off campus, whatever that is.
All right, so I think I have the last word, which is onwards. Thank you all very, very much.